The windshield wipers screamed against the glass as Ethan Morales watched his entire future disappear in the rearview mirror. A woman in a $3,000 suit stood ankle-deep in mud beside her stranded Mercedes, and in that split second he made the choice that would cost him everything, or give him everything he never dared to dream of. This is the story of how one missed interview became the most important meeting of his life. Stay with me until the end and drop a comment about which city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain came down like bullets that October morning, each drop exploding against the cracked windshield of Ethan Morales' 1998 Ford pickup. The truck wheezed and rattled as it climbed the hill on Route 47, its worn tires fighting for grip on the slick asphalt. Ethan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, not from the treacherous conditions, but from the weight of what this morning meant. In exactly 37 minutes, he had an interview at Hayes Global Industries, the kind of opportunity that didn't come twice for guys like him. Guys with community college degrees and resumes full of warehouse jobs. Guys raising 8-year-olds alone in apartments where the radiator clanged all night, and the landlord's eviction threats came as regularly as the mail. His phone duct-taped to the dashboard because the holder had broken months ago lit up with a reminder interview, 9:00 a.m., Hayes Global, downtown tower. He'd programmed it to alert him every 5 minutes for the past hour, paranoid that somehow he'd forget the most important appointment of his life. "You got this, Morales," he muttered to himself, practicing his handshake with one hand while steering with the other. "My name is Ethan Morales, and I'm here to That's when he saw her. The Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the kind of car that cost more than he'd made in the last 5 years combined, sat at an awkward angle on the shoulder, its rear wheels buried deep in the muddy runoff ditch that ran alongside the highway. Even through the rain-blurred windshield, he could see the woman standing beside it, her navy blue power suit already darkening with rain, her hands gesturing wildly as she screamed into her phone. Ethan's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Every instinct told him to keep driving. The digital clock on his phone showed 8:23 a.m. Downtown was still 20 minutes away in good conditions, and these were anything but good conditions. If he stopped now... But then he thought of Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, who'd watched Marcus for free last Tuesday when he couldn't afford the after-school program. He thought of Tommy at the auto shop, who'd replaced his brake pads on credit when he'd been dead broke in September. He thought of all the times someone had extended a hand when he'd needed it most. "Damn it," he whispered, already knowing what he was going to do. The truck's brakes squealed as he pulled over the sound cutting through the rain's percussion. He grabbed the emergency flasher's button and killed the engine. Through his side mirror, he watched the woman pace frantically, her expensive heels sinking into the soft earth with each step. She hadn't even noticed him stop. Ethan pulled his interview suit jacket tighter. The only nice thing he owned, bought secondhand from Goodwill and tailored by Mrs. Rodriguez down the hall for the price of fixing her kitchen sink. He couldn't let it get soaked. But as he watched the woman slip and nearly fall, catching herself on the Mercedes' door handle, he shrugged it off and draped it carefully over the passenger seat. The rain hit him like 1,000 tiny fists the moment he stepped out. His white dress shirt, ironed 3 times this morning, until every crease was perfect, immediately began to cling to his skin. His dress shoes polished until they gleamed, splashed into a puddle that swallowed them to the ankles. "Ma'am," he called out, jogging toward her. "Ma'am, you need help." She spun around, and for a moment Ethan forgot about the rain. The interview, everything. She was stunning in that untouchable way that came from money and breeding, sharp cheekbones, perfectly styled auburn hair now plastered to her head, green eyes that seemed to catalog everything about him in a single sweep. But it was the desperation in those eyes that made him pick up his pace. "Oh, thank God!" She rushed toward him, nearly losing a heel in the process. "My car, I hit a puddle and lost control, and now it's stuck, and I have a board meeting in 40 minutes that could determine the future of 500 jobs, and my phone's about to die, and the tow company said they can't get here for 2 hours because of the weather. And..." "Breathe," Ethan said, holding up his hands. "Just breathe, okay. Let me take a look." He circled the Mercedes, his trained eye assessing the situation. 8 years of working in warehouses and loading docks had taught him about weight distribution, leverage, and problem-solving with limited resources. The car wasn't damaged, just stuck. The angle was bad, but not impossible. He'd pulled plenty of delivery trucks out of worse spots, though never in dress clothes, and never when his entire future was ticking away by the second. "You got chains?" he asked. "Chains?" She looked at him like he'd asked if she carried a rocket launcher in her trunk. "Never mind, I've got some in my truck. But listen, I'm going to level with you. This is going to take at least 15, maybe 20 minutes to do right. Your car's in there pretty good." 20 minutes? Her voice cracked. "I can't. This meeting?" Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket. Another reminder. 8:27 a.m. now. If he left right now, drove like a maniac, maybe found a parking spot quickly, he might still make it. Might. "What about you?" she asked suddenly, seeming to really see him for the first time. The dress shirt, the muddy dress shoes, the way he kept glancing at his phone. "You're clearly heading somewhere important. Job interview?" he said simply, already walking back to his truck. "But you need help now." "Wait," she splashed after him. "A job interview. You're going to miss a job interview to help me." Ethan popped the rusted toolbox in his truck bed and pulled out the heavy chains, testing their strength with practiced hands. "Lady, you said 500 jobs depend on your meeting. Only one depends on mine. The math's pretty simple." He didn't tell her that the one job depending on his interview was the difference between keeping his son in their apartment or moving back to his sister's couch in Detroit. He didn't mention the stack of overdue bills held to his refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a dinosaur that Marcus had made in art class. He didn't explain that he'd spent his last $40 on gas to get to this interview and a new notebook to take notes if they hired him on the spot. "I can't let you do this," she said, but she was already stepping back, letting him work. "Not really your choice," Ethan grunted, sliding under the Mercedes with the chains not caring that the cold mud was soaking through his shirt. "Besides, what kind of person would I be if I left you here?" As he worked securing the chains to the Mercedes's frame, he thought about the practice interviews he'd done with Mrs. Chen, the old HR manager who lived in 3B. She'd made him repeat his answers over and over until they sounded natural. "Tell them about your problem-solving skills," she'd said. "Give them examples of thinking outside the box." Well, he thought grimly, crawling out from under the car covered in mud, this was certainly outside the box. "Okay," he called to the woman who was now huddled under the minimal shelter of a tree, trying futilely to protect her phone from the rain. "When I start pulling, you're going to need to steer. Keep the wheels straight, and when you feel it catch, give it just a little gas. Not too much, or you'll dig in deeper." She nodded, tottering back to the driver's door in her ruined heels. "What's your name?" she called out as he headed to his truck. "Ethan," he replied, not seeing the point in last names. After today, they'd never see each other again. "I'm Alexandra," she said. "And Ethan. Thank you. Whatever happens with your interview, any company would be lucky to have someone like you." He almost laughed at that. Someone like him. She had no idea what someone like him was: a high school graduate who'd gotten his girlfriend pregnant at 19, married her at 20, lost her to a drunk driver at 24, and had been scrambling to hold it together ever since. Someone who read mechanical engineering textbooks from the library at night after Marcus went to bed, dreaming of a degree he'd never afford. Someone who fixed neighbors' cars for grocery money and picked up every extra shift he could get, even if it meant seeing his son only at breakfast and bedtime. The Ford's engine roared to life, and Ethan carefully took up the slack in the chains. The first pull did nothing but spin his wheels. He eased off, let the truck settle, then tried again. This time, he felt the Mercedes shift slightly. "Give it a little gas," he shouted over the rain. The Mercedes's engine purred a smooth, expensive sound that made his truck sound like a dying animal in comparison. Inch by inch, with Ethan's truck straining and smoking, the luxury car began to emerge from the ditch. Mud flew everywhere, coating both vehicles, but finally, the Mercedes lurched free onto solid ground. Alexandra emerged from the car, laughing and crying at the same time, her composure completely shattered. "Oh my God, you did it! You actually did it!" Ethan was already unhooking the chains, his movements efficient despite his shaking hands. 8:44 a.m. It was over. Even if he left right now, he'd never make it. The interview he'd prepared for stressed over pinned all his hopes on gone. "Here," Alexandra said, pulling a wallet from her purse. "Please let me." Keep it, Ethan said flatly, tossing the muddy chains into his truck bed. I didn't do it for money. But your interview is gone. He couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. They were very clear about being on time. Hayes Global doesn't give second chances. Alexandra's face went white. Hayes Global. You had an interview at Hayes Global. Logistics coordinator position. Been preparing for 3 weeks. He slammed the toolbox shut harder than necessary. Look, you should get going. You're meeting those 500 jobs. Ethan, wait. But he was already in his truck, the engine turning over with a reluctant cough. He couldn't stand here and watch her drive away in her $100,000 car to her important meeting while his chance at a better life disappeared like the exhaust fumes in his rearview mirror. He had to at least try, even if it was hopeless. The drive to downtown was a blur of rain and regret. Every red light felt like a personal insult, every slow driver a deliberate obstacle. His phone rang twice, probably Marcus's school, calling about the field trip money he didn't have, but he ignored it. One crisis at a time. He found a parking spot 4 blocks from the Hayes Global building and ran through the rain, his dress shoes squelching with every step. By the time he burst through the revolving doors into the pristine marble lobby, he looked like he'd been swimming in his clothes. The security guard actually stepped forward, hand on his radio, before Ethan held up his hands. I have an interview, he gasped. 9th floor. I'm late, but... The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to pity. Buddy, you might want to... He gestured at Ethan's appearance. Ethan caught his reflection in the polished wall and almost laughed. His white shirt was transparent with rain and stained with mud. His pants were soaked through. His hair was plastered to his head, and there was actual mud on his face. He looked like he'd been in a fight with the earth itself and lost. But he'd come this far. The elevator ride felt eternal. Other passengers edged away from him, avoiding the puddle forming at his feet. When the doors opened on the 9th floor, revealing a pristine reception area with abstract art and leather furniture that probably cost more than his truck, Ethan almost turned around. But then he thought of Marcus, of the disappointment in his son's eyes, when he had to explain why they couldn't afford the new soccer cleats everyone else had. The receptionist, a young woman with perfect makeup and an expression of barely concealed horror, looked up as he approached. I'm Ethan Morales, he said, trying to project confidence despite the water dripping from his chin. I had a 9 o'clock interview for the logistics coordinator position. She consulted her screen, though they both knew what it would say. Mr. Morales, I'm afraid the interview panel has already moved on to the next candidate. Mr. Davidson made it very clear that punctuality is essential for this position. If I could just explain... I'm sorry, sir. The decision has been made. We'll keep your resume on file. The words hit him like physical blows. We'll keep your resume on file, corporate speak for you'll never hear from us again. Ethan stood there for a moment, water pooling around his feet on the immaculate carpet, feeling the weight of every bad decision, every piece of bad luck, every moment that had led him to this point. Thank you for your time, he said quietly, and turned to leave. The elevator ride down was worse than the one up. Now he wasn't racing toward hope. He was descending back to reality. Back to the overdue rent, the empty refrigerator, the exhausting cycle of poverty that ground you down a little more each day until you forgot you'd ever dreamed of anything better. He stood in the lobby for a moment, watching the rain lash against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He'd have to tell Marcus that Daddy didn't get the good job, that things would stay the same for a while longer. He'd have to face Mrs. Chen, who'd been so excited for him, so sure that this was his big break. He'd have to... Ethan! He turned to see Alexandra rushing through the revolving doors, her hair and suit somehow perfect again, as if the last hour hadn't happened. She was accompanied by 2 men in expensive suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a business magazine. Thank God you're still here, she said, slightly out of breath. I need you to come with me. Lady, I appreciate whatever this is, but it's Alexandra, she said. Alexandra Hayes, as in Hayes Global, as in the company you just interviewed with, as in the CEO whose ass you just saved on the side of the highway. The lobby seemed to tilt. Ethan grabbed the edge of a nearby planter to steady himself. You're the person you gave up your interview to help. Yes. Her green eyes were intense, focused. And now I need your help again. Please just come with me. Give me 10 minutes. You've already lost the interview. What else do you have to lose? Ethan wanted to laugh, or cry, or possibly both. The CEO. He'd been crawling in the mud, sacrificing his future for the CEO of the company he'd been trying to get hired by. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. 10 minutes, he said, because what else was he going to say? The universe clearly had a sick sense of humor, and he might as well see how the joke ended. Alexandra led him back to the elevators, but this time they went up past the 9th floor, past the 20th, all the way to the 35th, where the doors opened onto a different world. This wasn't cubicles and conference rooms. This was corporate power distilled into glass and chrome. The rain-soaked city spread out below them through windows that seemed to go on forever. "Ma'am?" one of the suited men said nervously. "The situation in the operations center—" "I know, Michael," Alexandra said, never taking her eyes off Ethan. "That's why Mr. Morales is here." She pushed through a set of double doors into chaos. The operations center was a massive room filled with screens showing maps, graphs, numbers scrolling in red. At least 20 people were scattered around, some shouting into phones, others typing furiously at computers. The energy was panic, pure and simple. "Status report," Alexandra barked, and the room seemed to pivot toward her. A harried-looking man with his tie askew rushed over. "It's worse than we thought. The system crash has corrupted the routing algorithms for the entire Northeast distribution network. We've got 800 trucks that don't know where they're supposed to be, 42 ships waiting for loading instructions at various ports, and approximately $18 million in inventory that's effectively lost in the system. Time to fix." The tech team says 72 hours minimum to rebuild the code from backups and re-input all the data manually. "We don't have 72 hours. We don't have 72 minutes. Alexandra turned to Ethan. "You applied for the logistics coordinator position. Your resume says you redesigned the warehouse management system at Conway Shipping, increasing efficiency by 30%. "That was, yeah, but it was a much smaller scale. Can you fix this?" Ethan looked at the screens, his mind automatically cataloging what he was seeing. It was a mess, but it was a familiar kind of mess. Like when the ancient computer system at Conway had crashed during the Christmas rush, and he'd had to route 200 deliveries using paper maps and Excel spreadsheets. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but I'd need to understand your system architecture and whatever you need." Alexandra's voice was steel. "Michael, give him full access. Everyone else you answer to him until this is fixed." "Ma'am," Michael protested, "with all due respect, we don't even know who this person is. He's not an employee. He hasn't been vetted." "This person," Alexandra said coldly, "gave up a job interview to pull me out of a ditch so I could make it here to handle this crisis. That tells me more about his character than any background check. Now give him access or update your resume." Michael paled and gestured to a workstation. "Whatever you need, sir." Ethan sat down at the computer, acutely aware that he was dripping on what was probably a $10,000 chair. The system interface loaded, and he began to navigate through it, his fingers moving almost automatically. It was more complex than Conway's system, but the bones were the same. Logistics was logistics, whether you were moving 10 packages or 10,000. "Okay," he said, pulling up multiple windows. "Your problem isn't actually the routing algorithm. It's the indexing. When the system crashed, it corrupted the location tag, so the algorithm doesn't know where anything is starting from. It's trying to create routes from nowhere to somewhere." "Can you fix it?" Alexandra asked. "Not fix exactly, but I can work around it." He was already typing, falling into the zone he entered when solving complex problems. "If we bypass the automatic routing and create a manual overlay using the last known positions from— do you have GPS data from the trucks themselves?" "Every truck has a transponder," someone called out. "Perfect. Pull that data cross-reference it with the delivery manifests from yesterday. Those should still be clean, and we can triangulate probable routes. It won't be perfect, but it'll get your trucks moving while the tech team rebuilds the system." His fingers flew across the keyboard, writing code, pulling data, building something from nothing. The room had gone quiet except for the clicking of keys and the occasional directive from Ethan. "I need someone to call the port authorities at Newark, Baltimore, and Boston," he said without looking up. "Tell them we're sending priority routing in the next 30 minutes. Someone else get me the inventory list from the past week, not from the corrupted system, from the backup servers. They're older, but they'll be clean." People jumped to follow his orders, and Ethan barely noticed. This was what he was good at, what he'd always been good at, seeing patterns, solving problems, making broken things work again. At Conway, they'd called him the miracle worker, though it had never translated to a promotion or a raise. An hour passed, then 2. At some point, someone put a cup of coffee at his elbow, and he drank it without tasting it. Alexandra stood behind him, watching silently as he rebuilt their entire distribution network from scratch, using duct tape and creativity where million-dollar systems had failed. "There," he said, finally hitting enter on the last command. "Check the boards." Everyone turned to the main screens. The red numbers flickered, held, then began to turn green. One by one, like dominoes falling in reverse, the system came back online. Trucks began moving on the digital map. Ships showed cargo loading. The hemorrhaging of money slowed, stopped, then reversed. The room erupted in cheers. People were hugging, crying, slapping Ethan on the back. Someone mentioned that he'd just saved the company millions, possibly tens of millions. But Ethan barely heard them. He was exhausted, soaked, and suddenly very aware that he was sitting in the executive operations center of a Fortune 500 company, looking like he'd been mud wrestling. "Everyone out," Alexandra said suddenly, and her tone brooked no argument. "Michael, implement Mr. Morales' solution and monitor for any issues. I need the room." The space emptied in seconds, leaving just Ethan and Alexandra. She walked to the window, looking out at the city below, where the rain was finally beginning to lighten. "Do you know what would have happened if I'd missed that board meeting?" she asked quietly. "You said 500 jobs. Conservative estimate. We're in the middle of a hostile takeover attempt. The board was voting on whether to accept a buyout offer from Kronos Corporation. If I hadn't been there to present the alternative strategy to show them the numbers," she turned to face him, "Kronos would have gutted this company. They'd have kept the name, the contracts, but they'd have outsourced everything. Thousands of jobs gone. Entire communities that depend on our distribution centers destroyed." "But you made it," Ethan said, "because you stopped. In the rain late for your own interview, you stopped." She walked back to him, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Do you know what the interview was for the logistics coordinator position? Entry-level management, decent pay benefits, a chance to move up. The person we hired instead of you. He showed up on time, gave perfect answers, had an MBA from Wharton." She smiled slightly. "He wouldn't have known where to start with the crisis you just solved. He wouldn't have stopped to help someone on the side of the road. He would have been perfectly punctual and perfectly useless." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. "I'm offering you a job," Alexandra said. "Not logistics coordinator. Senior Director of Emergency Operations. You'll be responsible for crisis management system redundancy and solving the problems that shouldn't exist but do anyway. I don't have an MBA. I don't even have a bachelor's degree. You have something better. You have the ability to see solutions where others see disasters. You have the character to sacrifice your own opportunities to help others. And you have the skill to back it all up." She named a salary that made Ethan's knees weak. "Plus, full benefit signing bonus, and we'll pay for you to get whatever degrees you want while you work." Ethan thought of Marcus of the apartment with the clanging radiator of all the nights he'd fallen asleep over library textbooks dreaming of a chance like this. "I need to make a phone call, Yuki," he said. Alexandra smiled. "Use my office. Second door on the right. Take all the time you need." The office was bigger than his entire apartment, with a view that seemed to encompass the entire world. Ethan pulled out his phone, still working miraculously, and dialed his sister's number. "Maria." "Yeah, it's me. I need you to pick up Marcus from school today." "No, everything's fine. Everything's perfect. I'll explain later. Just tell him Daddy got the job. A better job than we ever imagined." He ended the call and stood there for a moment, looking out at the city that had seemed so imposing this morning. The rain had stopped completely now, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds, turning the wet streets into rivers of gold. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Cars being detailed to remove the mud. Least I can do. Also, there's a company card waiting for you at reception. Buy yourself some new interview clothes. You start Monday. AH." Ethan laughed. Really laughed for the first time in months. This morning he'd thought missing that interview would be the end of everything. Instead, it had been the beginning. Sometimes the worst storms, the ones that threaten to destroy everything you've built, are really just clearing the path for something better. He walked back into the operations center where Alexandra was waiting with a contract and a pen. "Ready to change your life?" she asked. "Already did," Ethan said, taking the pen. "The moment I hit the brakes." As he signed his name, Ethan Morales, Senior Director of Emergency Operations, he thought about the chain of events that had led him here. A storm, a stuck car, a choice between self-interest and helping others. Mrs. Chen always said that character was what you did when nobody was watching and everything was on the line. Today, someone had been watching, and everything had been on the line. And for once in his life, making the right choice had led to the right outcome. "Welcome to Hayes Global, Mr. Morales," Alexandra said, shaking his hand. "Something tells me you're going to fit in just fine." Outside, the sun continued to break through the clouds, and 40 stories below, Ethan's battered pickup truck sat in the executive parking area, mud-splattered and proud, surrounded by Mercedes and BMWs and Teslas. It looked out of place, but it also looked exactly right, a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things come in unexpected packages. Monday morning would come soon enough, bringing new challenges and responsibilities Ethan could barely imagine. But for now, he stood in his ruined interview clothes in the executive suite of Hayes Global, having saved a company he didn't even work for yet, and thought about how he'd tell this story to Marcus tonight. How sometimes doing the right thing for its own sake was the best interview answer you could ever give. The city spread out before him, no longer intimidating, but full of possibility. Somewhere out there, his son was in school, probably drawing pictures of superheroes and race cars, not knowing that his father had just become something of a hero himself. Not the kind with a cape or superpowers, but the kind who stopped in the rain to help a stranger and changed the course of multiple lives in the process. Ethan Morales, Senior Director. It had a nice ring to it, but more importantly, Ethan Morales' father, who could now provide for his son, Ethan Morales. Man who'd learned that sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as disasters, and the worst setbacks are really just setups for something greater. The storm had passed, the sun was shining, and for the first time in 4 years since that drunk driver had shattered his world and left him to pick up the pieces alone, Ethan Morales felt like he could breathe. The weekend passed in a blur of disbelief and preparation. Ethan had spent Saturday morning at the mall with Marcus, watching his son's eyes grow wide as they walked past the discount stores where they usually shopped and into actual department stores. "Dad, are you sure?" Marcus had asked, holding a pair of Nike soccer cleats like they were made of gold. "These aren't even on sale." "We're sure, buddy," Ethan had replied, ruffling his son's dark hair. "Dad got a really good job. Things are going to be different now." But as Monday morning arrived, bringing with it the reality of walking into Hayes Global as an executive rather than a hopeful applicant, Ethan felt the full weight of what he'd taken on. The new suit he'd bought, the first brand new suit he'd ever owned, felt stiff and foreign against his skin. The shoes were so polished he could see his reflection in them, a far cry from the work boots he was accustomed to. He dropped Marcus off at school early, his son practically bouncing in his new sneakers. "Tell everyone my dad's a director now," Marcus had shouted as he ran toward the building, his Batman backpack bouncing against his shoulders. The pride in his voice made Ethan's throat tight with emotion. The drive to Hayes Global was different this time. No panic, no racing against the clock, no desperate prayers for just one chance. Instead, there was a parking pass for the executive garage and a security badge waiting for him at the reception desk. The same receptionist who'd turned him away on Friday now smiled warmly and called him Mr. Morales as she handed over his credentials. "Ms. Hayes asked me to tell you she'll meet you in your office at 9, she said. 20th floor, suite 2012. The executive assistant assigned to you is already there. Her name's Patricia." The elevator ride felt surreal. Other employees nodded respectfully, some even murmuring, "Good morning, sir." Ethan wanted to tell them he was the same guy who'd been dripping mud in their lobby 3 days ago, but he simply nodded back, trying to project a confidence he didn't quite feel. Suite 2012 turned out to be a corner office, with windows on 2 walls offering a panoramic view of the city. It was 3 times the size of his apartment, with a leather couch, a conference table, and a desk that looked like it belonged in a museum. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and knowing eyes stood as he entered. "Mr. Morales, I'm Patricia Chen," she said. and Ethan's heart skipped. Before you ask, yes, I'm related to the Mrs. Chen in your building. She's my aunt. She called me Friday night, told me all about you, said you're the hardest working man she knows and that Hayes Global was lucky to have you. Your aunt, she's been incredibly kind to my son and me. Ethan managed, still processing the coincidence. She speaks very highly of you both. Now let's get you oriented. You have a department meeting at 10 lunch with the CFO at noon, and Ms. Hayes wants to see you at 3 to discuss the Rotterdam situation. The Rotterdam situation? Patricia's expression grew serious. One of our major distribution centers in the Netherlands. Complete system failure as of 6 this morning, their time. Similar to what happened here Friday, but potentially worse. It's why Ms. Hayes expedited your start date. Before Ethan could respond, Alexandra swept into the office, her presence immediately commanding the space. Today she wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. His former monthly rent, he corrected himself. "Patricia, give us the room," she said, though her tone was warm. Once they were alone, she studied Ethan with those penetrating green eyes. Having second thoughts? More like third and fourth thoughts, Ethan admitted. Ms. Hayes. Alexandra. We're colleagues now. Alexandra, he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. I appreciate this opportunity, but I need you to know I've never managed people at this level. I've never dealt with international operations. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Do you know what qualified gets you? Alexandra interrupted, moving to the window. It gets you people who know how to fill out the right forms and say the right things in meetings. It gets you Michael Richardson, our previous director who had 2 master's degrees and 15 years of experience, and who also let our entire East Coast network collapse because he was too busy following protocol to see the obvious solution. She turned back to him. I didn't hire you because you're qualified. I hired you because when everything goes to hell, and in this business, it always does, you're the person who figures out how to fix it. The Rotterdam situation. 3 of our qualified people have been working on it for 6 hours. They've accomplished nothing except writing reports about why it can't be fixed quickly. And you want me to? I want you to do what you did Friday. Cut through the bureaucracy and solve the problem. She paused at the door. Oh, and Ethan, that interview suit looks good on you, but you might want to keep some work clothes here. Real crisis management tends to be messy. The department meeting at 10 was a trial by fire. 12 people, all with more experience and higher degrees than Ethan, sat around the conference table looking at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed resentment. He recognized the type they were, the ones who'd played by all the rules, climbed the ladder rung by rung, and here he was catapulted over them because he'd changed a tire in the rain. So, said a man with rimless glasses and a Princeton tie clip, perhaps you could share your strategic vision for the department, Mr. Morales. It was a test Ethan knew, a way to expose him as the imposter they suspected he was. 6 months ago, he would have fumbled, tried to fake his way through with corporate buzzwords he'd memorized from library books. But Friday had changed something in him. He'd sat in that executive operations center and solved a problem none of them could solve. He'd earned this seat at the table. My strategic vision, Ethan said slowly, is that we stop having crises to manage. Every problem we've had in the last year, I spent the weekend reviewing the files, has been a predictable failure we could have prevented. We're so busy putting out fires that nobody's checking the smoke detectors. That's a rather simplistic, Princeton began. Is it? Ethan pulled up a chart on his tablet, mirroring it to the room's screen. This is your incident report log for the past 12 months. See the pattern. Every major failure happened during a shift change, a holiday weekend, or a system update. We know when we're vulnerable, but we don't prepare for it. We just react after it happens. A woman with red hair and sharp features leaned forward. You're suggesting predictive crisis management. I'm suggesting we stop being surprised by the obvious. Rotterdam right now. Let me guess. They did a system update over the weekend skeleton crew, and something went wrong that nobody caught until the Monday morning shift arrived. The room went quiet. Princeton cleared his throat. How did you know that? Because it's the same thing that happened here Friday, and probably the same thing that happened in Chicago last month, and Seattle the month before that. Ethan stood moving to the whiteboard. We're a logistics company running on a schedule everyone knows. Our vulnerabilities are predictable, which means our failures are preventable. He started sketching out a diagram, his hands moving with the confidence that came from years of solving problems on warehouse floors. We need redundancy teams specifically for high-risk periods. We need system updates staggered across regions, so we're never completely vulnerable. We need— Mr. Morales, the red-haired woman interrupted. What you're proposing would cost millions. And Friday cost us how much? Ethan countered. Not just in immediate losses, but in client confidence, in overtime to fix the problems. In potential lawsuits, if shipments containing medical supplies had been delayed. The room fell silent again, but this time it was contemplative rather than skeptical. The red-haired woman, Sarah Martinez, according to her nameplate, nodded slowly. You're right. We've been treating symptoms instead of the disease. Look, Ethan said, setting down the marker. I know most of you are wondering why I'm here. Why someone with no degree and no executive experience is suddenly running this department. The truth is, I'm wondering the same thing. But I've spent 10 years on warehouse floors loading docks and in distribution centers. I've seen how these failures actually play out at ground level. So maybe instead of questioning whether I belong here, we could work together to make sure these failures stop happening. Princeton took off his glasses, cleaned them, and put them back on. The Rotterdam situation. If you're right about the pattern, then their backup system should still have clean data from Friday afternoon. Exactly, Ethan said. We don't need to rebuild from scratch. We just need to bridge the gap between Friday's backup and Monday's reality. I have contacts at Rotterdam who could give us remote access, Sarah offered. If you really think you can fix this— Not me, Ethan corrected. Us. I'm going to need everyone in this room if we're going to solve this before the European markets close. The shift in the room was palpable. Suddenly, they weren't looking at him as an outsider, but as someone offering a solution. Laptops opened, phones emerged, and within minutes the conference room had transformed into a war room. The Rotterdam fix took 4 hours. 4 hours of intense collaboration with Ethan, directing traffic, while his team, and somewhere in those 4 hours they'd become his team, executed the solution. Princeton turned out to be brilliant at coding workarounds. Sarah had connections throughout Europe who could implement changes on the ground. Others brought their own expertise, and Ethan orchestrated it all, like a conductor leading an orchestra through a complex symphony. When the Rotterdam Distribution Center came back online at 2:47 p.m., their time just minutes before the market closed, the conference room erupted in exhausted celebration. Princeton actually shook Ethan's hand, his grip firm and respectful. That was impressive, he admitted. I've never seen anyone approach a problem quite like that. That's because I've never had a team this good to work with, Ethan replied, and he meant it. These people knew things he didn't have, skills he lacked. But what he brought was the ability to see through the complexity to the simple solution underneath, and the leadership to get everyone moving in the same direction. Lunch with the CFO had to be postponed. Nobody wanted to leave while Rotterdam was still in crisis, so Patricia had sandwiches brought in. Ethan found himself eating a turkey club, while simultaneously coordinating with teams in 3 time zones, and it felt more natural than any formal lunch meeting would have. At 3 o'clock, Alexandra appeared in the doorway. The conference room was a mess of empty coffee cups, whiteboards covered in diagrams, and exhausted but satisfied employees. She took it all in with one sweep of her eyes, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Rotterdam's fully operational, she asked. As of 17 minutes ago, Sarah reported. All shipments are moving, no data loss, and the client notifications have gone out. We're estimating minimal impact on delivery schedules. Excellent. Alexandra's gaze found Ethan. My office, please. As Ethan followed her out, he heard Princeton say to Sarah, I take back what I said this morning. He's exactly what this department needed. Alexandra's office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 35th floor. It was less an office and more a command center with multiple screens showing real-time data from Hayes Global Operations worldwide. She gestured for him to sit in one of the leather chairs facing her desk. You handled that well, she said, pouring 2 cups of coffee from a service that probably cost more than Ethan's weekly grocery budget. Getting buy-in from that team isn't easy. Michael Richardson tried for 2 years and never managed it. They just needed to see that I wasn't here to make their lives harder, Ethan said, accepting the coffee. It was perfect, strong, rich, nothing like the break room coffee he was used to. Most of them are brilliant at what they do. They just needed someone to coordinate their efforts. Is that what you think your job is? Coordination? Ethan considered the question. No. My job is to make sure that when things break, and they will break, we fix them before they become disasters, and eventually to make sure they break less often. Good. Alexandra pulled up something on her tablet. Because I have something else for you to consider. We're acquiring a smaller logistics company, Henderson Shipping. They have excellent regional networks, but terrible systems integration. The board is concerned about the merger creating vulnerabilities. When's the acquisition scheduled? 6 weeks. Ethan whistled low. That's not much time for integration. Which is why I want you leading the transition team. It'll mean traveling to their facilities, working with their people, and essentially rebuilding their entire operational framework to mesh with ours. Alexandra, I've been here exactly 1 day. And in that day, you've solved 2 major crises and gotten the most stubborn department in the company to follow your lead. She leaned back in her chair. I know it's a lot to ask. It would mean long hours time away from your son. I wouldn't blame you if you wanted to settle in first, take things slowly. Ethan thought about Marcus, about the promises he'd made to spend more time with him now that things were better. But he also thought about proving himself, about securing their future, about showing everyone, including himself, that he deserved this chance. Can I bring my son with me sometimes, when the travel is on weekends? Alexandra's expression softened. Ethan, you're an executive now. You set your own schedule within reason. If you need to bring your son, bring him. If you need to work from home some days, do it. I hired you for your ability to solve problems, not to warm a chair for a set number of hours. Then yes, I'll lead the transition team. Excellent. Patricia will have the files sent to your office. Oh, and Ethan. She pulled out a black credit card and slid it across the desk. Corporate card. For travel client dinners and anything else you need for the job. Don't be shy about using it. It's a tool, not a perk. The weight of the card in his hand felt significant, like holding a key to a door he'd never thought he'd be allowed to open. Thank you for all of this. For taking a chance on... Stop, Alexandra interrupted. I'm not taking a chance. I'm making a strategic decision based on demonstrated performance. You saved this company millions of dollars before you even officially worked here. You've proven yourself. Now stop being grateful and start being the executive I hired you to be. As Ethan stood to leave, she added, Your son, Marcus Wright, 8 years old. Yes, how did you take? Patricia's thorough. Alexandra smiled. The company has a family day next month. Bring him. Let him see where his father works, what you've accomplished. Children should be proud of their parents. The rest of the afternoon was a whirlwind of meetings, introductions, and information absorption. Ethan met with IT to understand the system's architecture, with legal to grasp the implications of the Henderson acquisition, with operations to learn the global network he was now responsible for protecting. His brain felt like it might explode from information overload, but he took careful notes, asked questions, and slowly began to see the full picture of Hayes Global's massive operation. By 6 o'clock, the office had begun to empty, but Ethan remained at his desk studying the Henderson files. Their system was a mess, outdated software, no standardization across facilities, and critical vulnerabilities that made Friday's crisis look minor by comparison. It would take a miracle to integrate them smoothly in 6 weeks. You planning to sleep here? He looked up to find Sarah Martinez in his doorway, her jacket over her arm. Just trying to understand what we're up against with Henderson, he said, rubbing his eyes. Word of advice. She came in and perched on the edge of his desk, a familiarity that suggested acceptance. Don't try to learn everything in 1 day. Michael Richardson tried that. Burned out in 6 months, started making mistakes, and eventually created more problems than he solved. Is that what happened to him? Alexandra mentioned he let the East Coast network collapse. Sarah nodded. He was so overwhelmed by trying to know everything that he couldn't see the obvious solution right in front of him. Don't make the same mistake. You've got good instincts, trust them. Thanks. And Sarah, thanks for backing me up in there today with Princeton and the others. You earned it. She stood to go, then paused. You know, when we heard Alexandra had hired someone off the street, literally, we all thought she'd lost her mind. But seeing you work today, you think differently than the rest of us. You see solutions we miss because we're too educated to recognize simple fixes. Don't lose that. After she left, Ethan packed up his things, still marveling at the fact that he had an office to pack up from. As he walked to the elevator, he passed the night cleaning crew beginning their work. One of them, an older Hispanic man, looked familiar. "Carlos?" Ethan said, recognizing him from Conway Shipping. "Carlos Mendoza." The man's face lit up. "Ethan, Chaos is a key. What are you doing here in a suit?" "I work here now. Started today." Carlos whistled appreciatively. "Moving up in the world, huh? Good for you, man. You always were too smart for that warehouse." They chatted for a few minutes, and Ethan made a mental note to find out more about the night crew's working conditions. These were the people who kept the building running, who made it possible for executives to walk into clean offices every morning. They deserved respect and fair treatment. The drive home felt different than any commute he'd ever had. He wasn't exhausted from physical labor, but his mind was spinning with possibilities, problems, and solutions. The radio played something about market volatility, and for the first time, Ethan understood how that might affect Hayes Global's shipping volumes. Marcus was at Mrs. Chen's apartment when he arrived doing homework at her kitchen table while she cooked something that smelled amazing. "Daddy." Marcus jumped up, running to hug him. "Mrs. Chen's teaching me to make dumplings, and she said her niece works at your new company." "That's right, buddy. Small world, isn't it?" Ethan accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Chen, who was beaming with pride. "Patricia called me," she said quietly, while Marcus went back to his homework. "Said you handled yourself like you'd been an executive for years. I knew you had it in you." "I couldn't have done any of this without your help, Mrs. Chen. All those practice interviews watching Marcus when I couldn't afford daycare." "Family helps family," she said firmly, "and you've been family since the day you fixed my sink and refused to take payment." They ate dinner together. Mrs. Chen insisted, and Marcus chattered about his day, about how he'd told everyone his dad was a director at a big company, about how Jimmy Valdez didn't believe him until the teacher confirmed it was true. The pride in his voice made every challenge of the day worth it. Later, after they'd returned to their own apartment and Marcus was asleep, Ethan sat at their small kitchen table with his laptop continuing to study the Henderson files. The radiator clanged its familiar rhythm, but now instead of being a reminder of poverty, it was a metronome marking his progress from where he'd been to where he was going. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. When he opened it, he found a photo of the muddy Mercedes from Friday, now gleaming in what looked like a high-end auto shop. The message read, "Got all the mud out. Car looks better than ever. Sometimes getting stuck leads to improvements. AH." Ethan smiled, saving the number under Alexandra Hayes, CEO. Then he went back to his files, planning the integration that everyone said would be impossible in 6 weeks. But then everyone had said a warehouse worker couldn't become an executive in a single day, and here he was. Outside his window, the city lights twinkled like stars brought down to earth. Somewhere out there, trucks were moving, ships were loading, and the vast network of Hayes Global's operations was humming along. And now he was part of it, not just as a cog in the machine, but as one of the people making sure the machine kept running. The Henderson acquisition would be his first real test. Not a crisis dropped in his lap, but a challenge he had to see coming and prevent from becoming a crisis. It would mean long days, complicated negotiations, and juggling responsibilities he was still learning existed. But sitting there in his small apartment with his son sleeping safely in the next room and a future that finally looked bright, Ethan felt ready for all of it. He pulled up a new document and began typing Henderson Integration Strategy, Draft 1. At the top, he wrote a simple mission statement: transition without disruption, integration without chaos, success without sacrifice. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but then Ethan Morales had built his new life on achieving the impossible. One muddy Mercedes, one stopped interview, one moment of choosing others over himself had changed everything. Now it was time to prove that Alexandra's faith in him and his faith in himself wasn't misplaced. The radiator clanged again, and Ethan smiled. By next month, they'd be in a better apartment, one with proper heating and windows that didn't leak. But he'd missed this sound, this reminder of where he'd come from and how far he'd traveled. It was the soundtrack of his transformation, the rhythm of resilience that had carried him from desperation to hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Henderson team would probably resist the changes he needed to implement. His own team would be watching to see if Friday's success was a fluke or a pattern. Alexandra would be expecting results that justified her unconventional hiring decision. But tonight, Ethan Morales, single father, former warehouse worker, newly minted senior director of emergency operations, sat in his humble apartment and planned the future of a multi-billion-dollar logistics network. The contrast should have been jarring, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Because sometimes the best person to prevent a crisis wasn't someone who'd never experienced one, but someone who'd lived through so many that crisis management had become second nature. Someone who knew what it was like to juggle impossible responsibilities with limited resources. Someone who understood that when everything was on the line, you didn't have the luxury of perfect solutions, you just had to find something that worked. As midnight approached, Ethan finally closed his laptop. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it the weight of executive responsibility. But he'd carried heavier weights, the weight of grief, of single parenthood, of dreams deferred but not destroyed. This was just a different kind of load, and he'd learned long ago how to bear what needed bearing. He checked on Marcus one more time, watching his son sleep peacefully, unaware that his life had fundamentally changed. The soccer cleats sat by his bed, still pristine and new. Soon, Ethan thought those shoes would be scuffed and muddy from actual playing, not just dreaming. Soon, Marcus would have the chances Ethan had never had. That was worth any amount of pressure, any number of sleepless nights studying integration strategies and crisis protocols. That was worth proving himself over and over again until even Princeton, with his tie clip, would admit that Ethan Morales belonged in that conference room, in that office, in that life. The storm that had brought Alexandra Hayes into his life had passed, but Ethan knew there would be other storms. Corporate storms, strategic storms, the storms that came with trying to merge two incompatible systems into one functional whole. But he'd weathered worse storms than anything the business world could throw at him. And this time, he had better tools than just determination and duct tape. He had a team, resources, and the backing of a CEO who'd seen something in him that he was only beginning to see in himself. He had Patricia Chen, who would keep him organized, and Sarah Martinez, who would keep him grounded. He had the respect earned from solving impossible problems and the authority to prevent those problems from recurring. Most importantly, he had the knowledge that he'd already survived the worst day of his professional life, showing up late, muddy, and hopeless to a lost opportunity, and it had transformed into the best day. If he could turn that disaster into triumph, he could handle whatever came next. The alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., but Ethan was already awake, laptop open on the kitchen table, surrounded by coffee cups and integration charts. He'd discovered something in the Henderson files that had kept him up most of the night. Not a problem, but an opportunity so significant it could change the entire acquisition strategy. Henderson Shipping, for all its technical failures, had something Hayes Global desperately needed: contracts with small rural hospitals throughout the Midwest. Medical supply routes that the bigger company had deemed too costly to pursue, but which Henderson had been servicing for decades. If integrated properly, these routes could open an entirely new market sector. "Dad?" Marcus stood in the doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes. "Why are you up so early?" "Sorry, buddy, did I wake you?" Ethan closed the laptop and pulled his son onto his lap. "Just doing some homework for work." "Grown-ups don't have homework," Marcus said with the certainty only an 8-year-old could muster. "This grown-up does. Every day I'm learning something new." He ruffled Marcus's hair. "Go back to bed. We've got 2 more hours before school." But Marcus snuggled closer instead. "Is your new job hard?" "Sometimes. But you know what makes it easier? Knowing I'm doing it for us, for our future." "Mom would be proud of you," Marcus said quietly, and Ethan's heart clenched. The boy rarely mentioned his mother anymore, as if speaking about her might make the loss fresh again. "She would be proud of both of us," Ethan whispered, holding his son tighter. After Marcus went back to bed, Ethan showered and dressed in his second new suit, still marveling at how different he looked in the mirror. The man staring back at him bore little resemblance to the desperate father who'd stood in this same bathroom just a week ago, wondering how he'd make rent. The drive to work in the pre-dawn darkness had become his thinking time. Today's challenge would be the first meeting with Henderson's executive team. They were flying in from Cincinnati, defensive and worried about their jobs, their autonomy, their company's identity being swallowed by the Hayes Global machine. Ethan had seen it before on a smaller scale, the fear that came with change, the resistance that could sabotage even the best-intentioned integration. He arrived at the office before 6, finding only the night security and cleaning crew still there. Carlos was emptying trash bins in the executive conference room. "Morning, Carlos," Ethan said, setting down his briefcase. "How's your daughter? Still at community college?" Carlos looked surprised that anyone, let alone an executive, remembered their previous conversations. "She's good, Mr. Morales. Actually, she just switched her major to logistics management. Says it's a growing field." "It is. Tell you what of her, send me her resume. We have a summer internship program, and I'd be happy to put in a word." The older man's eyes welled with tears. "You do that? Carlos, you work hard. You deserve to have doors open for your family. Email me her information." Ethan pulled out a business card, still feeling slightly surreal about having them. "My direct email's on there." By 7, the office was beginning to fill. Patricia arrived with his schedule and a warning: "The Henderson team isn't happy. Their CEO, Richard Henderson, specifically requested that Alexandra handle this meeting personally. He sees being handed off to you as an insult." He's probably right to be insulted," Ethan said, reviewing the files one more time. His company's being absorbed by a competitor, and instead of the CEO, he gets the new guy who nobody's heard of. I'd be angry too. "So, how are you going to handle it?" Ethan thought about all the times he'd been dismissed, overlooked, judged before being given a chance to prove himself. By showing him something he doesn't expect. The Henderson team arrived at 9 sharp 5 executives in identical Navy suits, moving like a defensive unit with Richard Henderson at the center. Henderson himself was in his 60s, silver-haired and stern-faced, with the bearing of someone who'd built his company from nothing and was watching it slip away. The Hayes Global team assembled in the main conference room: Ethan, Sarah Princeton, and 3 others from various departments. Alexandra made a brief appearance to welcome everyone, then departed with a meaningful look at Ethan that said, "This is your show." "Gentlemen, lady," Henderson began before Ethan could speak, nodding to his one female executive. "Let me be clear. We're here because we have no choice. The board voted to accept your offer. But I'll be damned if I'll let you destroy what we've built over 40 years. "Good," Ethan said, and the room went silent. "That's exactly the attitude I want." Henderson blinked. "Excuse me. Mr. Henderson, I've spent the last 72 hours studying your company. You've built something remarkable. Roots nobody else would take, relationships with communities everyone else ignored, loyalty from drivers who've been with you for decades. I'm not here to destroy that. I'm here to make sure we don't." Ethan pulled up a presentation on the screen, but instead of the corporate PowerPoint, everyone expected it was a hand-drawn map, the kind Ethan used to sketch on warehouse walls. "This is your network," he said, pointing to the sprawling web of routes. "And this is ours." A second map appeared. "Look at the overlap, or rather, look at the lack of overlap. You go where we don't. You serve people we can't reach. You know what that makes you." "A redundancy," Henderson's CFO said bitterly. "Essential," Ethan corrected. "You're not being absorbed because you're failing. You're being integrated because you have something we need: access to markets we've been trying to crack for years." He clicked to the next slide, the rural hospital contracts he'd discovered during his late-night research. "These medical supply routes, you're barely breaking even on them, right?" Henderson nodded slowly. "It's a service we provide to the communities. My father started the company in one of those towns. We don't abandon our roots. And Hayes Global has the infrastructure to make those routes profitable without cutting service. Our volume discounts your relationships. We can maintain your commitment to those communities while actually making money doing it." "You're talking about keeping our roots intact." Henderson's operations director leaned forward. "I'm talking about expanding them. With Hayes Global's resources and your ground knowledge, we could have medical supply coverage for every rural hospital in the Midwest within 18 months. The room's energy shifted. Ethan could feel it the moment when defensiveness began to crack and curiosity crept in. "What about our people?" Henderson asked. "I've got drivers who've been with me 20 years, dispatchers who know every back road in Ohio. They're not just employees, they're family." This was the crucial moment. Ethan had anticipated this question, had thought about it while watching Marcus sleep, remembering his own fear of being expendable. Mr. Henderson, last Friday, I was unemployed. A single father with no degree, no connections, and no prospects. I got this job because I stopped to help someone in the rain, even though it cost me an interview. Alexandra Hayes hired me, not despite that choice, but because of it. She understood that the best business decisions aren't always about the bottom line, they're about people. He stood moving to the window that overlooked the city. Your drivers know things our algorithms never will. Which roads flood in spring, which hospitals have loading dock issues, which dispatchers at which facilities are helpful versus obstructive. That knowledge is invaluable. We'd be idiots to lose it. So you're saying no layoffs? Henderson's HR director asked. I'm saying we evaluate based on performance and need not on which logo is on the paycheck. Some redundancies are inevitable when you merge two companies, but anyone who's doing their job well and wants to stay will have a place. That's not just my promise, that's Alexandra Hayes' direct instruction. Princeton cleared his throat. Ethan, the integration timeline will be challenging, Ethan finished. Which is why I'm proposing something unconventional. Instead of us imposing our systems on Henderson, we run parallel operations for the first month, learn from each other, find out what works best from both companies before we integrate. That would be expensive, Sarah pointed out, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely opposed. Not as expensive as a failed integration, not as expensive as losing 40 years of community relationships and driver knowledge. Ethan turned back to Henderson. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to work with me. Show us what you do better than anyone else, and we'll give you the resources to do it even better. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying Ethan with eyes that had seen plenty of corporate promises broken. You said you were unemployed last Friday. What were you before that? Warehouse supervisor at Conway Shipping, before that loading dock at Peterson Freight, before that anywhere that would hire a 24-year-old widower with a baby and a high school diploma. You came up from the floor, Henderson said, and it wasn't a question. Every rung of the ladder. I've driven trucks loaded cargo, dealt with angry customers at 3 a.m. I know what it's like to have some executive who's never done the job tell you how to do it better. Henderson's weathered face cracked into the first smile since he'd arrived. 30 years ago I was driving one of my own trucks, got stuck in a snowstorm outside of Indianapolis, thought I was going to lose my whole load of medical supplies. Another driver stopped, helped me get unstuck, followed me to make sure I made my delivery. That driver worked for Hayes Global. The room went still. I never forgot that, Henderson continued. When Hayes made their first acquisition offer 5 years ago, I said no, partly because I remembered that driver, and I couldn't believe the same company that employed him would honor what we'd built. But maybe I was wrong about that. The rest of the meeting transformed from negotiation to collaboration. Henderson's team began sharing their challenges, outdated software maintenance costs on an aging fleet, difficulty competing with larger companies for contracts. Ethan's team responded with solutions, resources, possibilities. By lunch, they'd sketched out a preliminary integration plan that preserved Henderson's core identity while leveraging Hayes Global's infrastructure. Alexandra appeared as the meeting was concluding, having somehow timed her arrival perfectly. Mr. Henderson, I trust Ethan has addressed your concerns. He has, Henderson said, shaking Ethan's hand with a grip that spoke of years of manual labor. You've got a good man here, Ms. Hayes. Don't let the suits ruin him. I have no intention of that, Alexandra replied. In fact, I'm hoping he ruins a few suits himself. The corporate world could use more people who understand what actually happens on the ground. After the Henderson team left for their hotel, Alexandra asked Ethan to walk with her. They ended up on the building's roof garden, 35 floors above the city, where the October wind carried hints of winter. You handled that brilliantly, she said, looking out over the skyline. Henderson's been resistant to acquisition for years. What you accomplished in one meeting would have taken our previous team months. He just needed to know his people would be taken care of. That's what everyone needs, really. Security, respect, a sense that their work matters. Is that what you needed? Ethan thought about the question. A week ago, I needed a job. Any job. But what you gave me was something different, A chance to prove that where I came from could be an asset, not a liability. Tell me about the medical supply routes. That wasn't in any of our analysis. Because your analysts were looking at profit margins. I was looking at community impact. Those rural hospitals Henderson serves, they're often the only medical facility for 50 miles. Losing those supply routes wouldn't just be a business failure, it would be a humanitarian crisis. Alexandra turned to face him fully. And you think we can make them profitable? I know we can. Economy of scale optimized routing shared warehouse facilities. We could cut costs by 30% without reducing service. Maybe even improve it. Write it up. Full proposal. I want to see numbers, projections, implementation strategy. If it's as promising as you think, we'll present it to the board next month. Next month. But that's when we're having the company family day. Bring your son, let him see you present to the board. Let him see his father changing lives. The weight of that settled on Ethan's shoulders. Presenting to the board of directors with Marcus watching, the kid who'd grown up thinking success meant having a job with benefits would see his father speaking to people who controlled billions in assets. The afternoon flew by in a blur of spreadsheets and strategy sessions. Sarah worked with him on the financial projections, her expertise filling the gaps in his knowledge. Princeton helped with the technical integration requirements, his initial skepticism replaced by genuine enthusiasm for the project. You know, Princeton said as they worked through routing algorithms, I owe you an apology. When you first arrived, I thought you were just Alexandra's charity case, someone she'd hired on a whim. Maybe I was, Ethan said, adjusting a calculation. But that doesn't mean I can't earn my place. You already have. The Henderson team was ready for war and you turned them into allies in 3 hours. That's not charity, that's talent. By 7 o'clock, Ethan's eyes were burning from staring at screens, but the proposal was taking shape. The numbers were better than he'd hoped, not just profitable, but potentially game-changing. If they could successfully integrate Henderson's rural network with Hayes Global's resources, they'd have a lock on medical logistics for the entire middle of the country. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen. Marcus is doing homework and had dinner. Take your time. He's proud his daddy is working late on important things. That gave him another hour, which he used to call 3 of Henderson's biggest clients, rural hospital administrators he'd found in the files. He introduced himself, explained the acquisition, and asked what they needed from their medical supply company. Their answers were unanimous reliability, understanding of their unique challenges, and a partner who saw them as more than just small accounts. We've been with Henderson for 15 years, one administrator in Kansas told him. Richard always answers his phone even at midnight. His drivers know to use the back entrance when our main loading dock is blocked. They understand that when we order emergency supplies, it's literally life and death. Can Hayes Global promise that same level of service? We can promise better, Ethan said, and meant it. Henderson's commitment with our resources. Same drivers who know your facility, but with newer trucks and better tracking systems. Same personal service, but with the ability to source from multiple warehouses, if something's out of stock. If you can deliver on that, Mr. Morales, you'll have our continued business. After the calls, Ethan sat back in his chair looking out at the city lights. A week ago, he'd been nobody, another invisible worker, struggling to make ends meet. Now he was negotiating million-dollar contracts and reshaping how a Fortune 500 company thought about rural markets. The transformation was dizzying, but underneath it all, he was still the same person, someone who solved problems, who saw opportunities others missed, who understood that business was ultimately about people. His desk phone rang the internal line from the lobby. Mr. Morales, there's a woman here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent. Her name is Jennifer Walsh. The name hit him like a physical blow. Jennifer was Lisa's sister, Marcus's aunt. She'd fought for custody after Lisa's death, claiming Ethan was unfit, too poor, too overwhelmed to raise a child alone. The courts had sided with him, but barely. She'd promised to keep watching, waiting for him to fail. Send her up, he said, his mouth suddenly dry. Jennifer arrived looking exactly as he remembered, polished, professional, radiating disapproval. She was a corporate lawyer, had always looked down on Ethan as not good enough for her sister, and had been proven right in her mind when he couldn't provide the life Lisa deserved. Ethan, she said, taking in his office with obvious surprise. This is unexpected. Jennifer, what brings you here? I heard about your new position, director at Hayes Global. Rather sudden, isn't it? I earned it, Ethan said evenly. What do you want? She sat without invitation, her posture rigid. I want to know if this is real, or if you're being set up to fail, because if this is some temporary situation that's going to implode and leave Marcus worse off than before. It's real, Ethan interrupted. I have a contract, a salary that ensures Marcus will want for nothing, and the backing of the CEO herself. The CEO who hired you off the street. That doesn't sound stable, Ethan. It sounds like a whim that could be reversed just as quickly. Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from Alexandra. Heard you're still in the office. Stop by before you leave. Important news. Jennifer, I appreciate your concern for Marcus, but do you... Because from where I'm sitting, you've always put your pride before his welfare. Too proud to accept help, too proud to admit when you're in over your head. Too proud to let you take my son and raise him to be ashamed of where he came from, Ethan shot back. Yes, I am too proud for that. She flinched. I never wanted him to be ashamed. I wanted him to have opportunities. He has them now, real ones, not just material things, but the chance to see his father succeed through hard work and integrity. That's worth more than any trust fund. Jennifer stood to leave, then paused. Lisa would have been proud of you, you know. She always said you could be more than you believed. I worry. This seems too good to be true. Sometimes good things happen, Ethan said softly. Sometimes stopping to help someone in the rain changes everything. After she left, Ethan made his way to Alexandra's office, still shaken from the encounter. Alexandra was standing at her window, phone to her ear, but she waved him in. Yes, Senator, I understand your concerns about rural hospital access, she was saying. Actually, I have my Director of Emergency Operations here now, and we're developing a comprehensive plan to ensure no disruption in medical supplies during the integration. She put the call on speaker. Senator Reynolds, this is Ethan Morales. He's leading the Henderson acquisition. Mr. Morales. The senator's voice boomed through the speaker. I've got constituents worried about their hospitals losing Henderson service. Richard Henderson has been supplying some of these facilities since before I was in office. Can you guarantee continuity? Senator, I can guarantee improvement, Ethan said. Every Henderson route will be maintained, every driver who wants to stay will have a job, and within 6 months, we'll have reduced delivery times by 20% through optimized routing. And the personal touch. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, Mr. Morales. These are communities that depend on knowing their supply chain is reliable. Senator, last week I was loading trucks myself. I know the difference between a spreadsheet and reality. Henderson's people know things our computers never will, and we're keeping that knowledge. We're just giving them better tools to use it. There was a pause, then the senator chuckled. You sound different from the usual corporate types, Mr. Morales. Alexandra, where'd you find this one? On the side of a highway in a rainstorm, Alexandra said, smiling at Ethan. The best hiring decision I've ever made. After the call ended, Alexandra poured 2 glasses of what looked like very expensive scotch. The senator's support is crucial for the acquisition. You just secured it. I just told the truth, which is surprisingly rare in these circles. She handed him a glass. Your ex-sister-in-law was here. How did you... Building security alerts me to any unusual visitors for my executives. Jennifer Walsh has a reputation as a fierce custody attorney. Should I be concerned? Ethan took a sip of the scotch, which burned pleasantly. She's always thought I wasn't good enough for Marcus. For years, she was right. Now, I don't know. Maybe she's worried I'll screw this up. Will you? Everyone keeps asking me that in different ways. You, Jennifer, even I ask myself. But here's what I know: I've already survived my worst-case scenario. Lisa dying, raising Marcus alone, barely keeping our heads above water. Everything else is manageable by comparison. Alexandra studied him for a moment. The board meeting next month. I want you to present the full Rural Medical Supply Initiative. Not just the Henderson integration, but a comprehensive strategy for serving underserved markets. That's significantly bigger than what we discussed. You're thinking too small, Ethan. You see the opportunity with Henderson, but there are a dozen other small regional carriers with similar profiles. If we can prove the model with Henderson, we could revolutionize medical logistics for rural America. The scope of it was staggering. Ethan set down his glass, his mind already racing through possibilities. We'd need a dedicated division, specialized training for urban drivers not familiar with rural routes, partnerships with local medical facilities. See, you're already solving it. Alexandra moved to her desk, pulling up something on her computer. I'm promoting Sarah Martinez to deputy director under you. You'll need someone with her financial expertise to make the numbers work. Princeton will handle technical integration. You'll have a team of 15 to start more as needed. This morning I was worried about one acquisition. Now you're talking about transforming an entire market sector. Because this morning you proved you could handle it. Henderson was never just about acquiring a company, Ethan. It was about testing whether you could see the bigger picture. You passed. As Ethan left the building that night, his head spinning with possibilities and responsibilities, he thought about the strange path that had led him here. A week ago, he'd been prepared to beg for an entry-level position. Now he was designing strategies that could affect healthcare access for millions of people. Marcus was asleep when he got home, but there was a drawing on the kitchen table. It showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of a tall building. Daddy's work was written in careful 8-year-old handwriting. At the bottom, Marcus had added, "My dad is a hero." Ethan sat at the table staring at the drawing, and for the first time since Lisa's death, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was becoming the man she'd always believed he could be. Not just surviving, but thriving. Not just providing, but leading. Not just working, but making a difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Henderson integration alone would test every skill he had and several he'd need to develop. The Rural Medical Supply Initiative was ambitious, bordering on impossible. Jennifer would keep watching, waiting for him to fail. The board presentation loomed like a mountain to climb, but tonight in his small apartment with his son's drawing in his hands, Ethan Morales felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine optimism. The storm that had changed his life was over, but the forecast ahead, while challenging, looked bright. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from Richard Henderson. "My drivers want to meet you. They're scared about the acquisition. Would you come to Cincinnati this weekend? Bring your boy if you want. We're having a company barbecue Saturday. Let them see you're human." Ethan typed back, "We'll be there." Marcus would love a road trip, and the Henderson drivers needed to see that the man making decisions about their future understood their world. It was exactly the kind of bridge building that spreadsheets and presentations couldn't accomplish. As he got ready for bed, Ethan thought about his father, who'd worked construction until his back gave out, who'd never missed a day until the day he couldn't get up anymore. His father had taught him that work was dignity, that providing for your family was the most important thing a man could do. But now Ethan was learning something his father never had the chance to discover, that sometimes work could be more than survival. Sometimes it could be transformation, not just of your own life, but of others. Sometimes the right person in the right place at the right moment could change everything. The radiator clanged its nightly symphony, but Ethan barely heard it. He was already thinking about Saturday, about standing in front of Henderson's drivers and showing them that their futures were safe in his hands. He thought about the board presentation, about looking those executives in the eye and making them see that profit and purpose didn't have to be mutually exclusive. Most of all, he thought about Marcus, watching him present, seeing his father not as the struggling single parent who could barely make rent, but as someone who stood confidently in front of powerful people and spoke about changing lives. That was worth every late night, every challenge, every moment of imposter syndrome that still occasionally crept in. Because success wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder, it was about pulling others up with you. And Ethan Morales, who'd stopped to pull a stranger's Mercedes out of the mud, understood that better than most. The drive to Cincinnati began at dawn on Saturday. Marcus, bouncing excitedly in the passenger seat of their rented SUV, Ethan's truck wasn't reliable enough for the 3-hour journey, and the company car felt too formal for a barbecue. The boy had packed his soccer ball, his Nintendo Switch, and approximately half his wardrobe, unable to decide what to wear to meet Dad's new work people. "Are they going to be wearing suits?" Marcus asked for the 10th time as they merged onto I-75. "No, buddy, it's a barbecue. They're truck drivers and warehouse workers, people like Dad used to work with. Regular clothes are fine." But you're their boss now, right? Not exactly. It's complicated. I'm helping make sure they still have jobs when our companies become one company. Marcus considered this with 8-year-old seriousness.
So you're like a superhero who saves jobs instead of people.
Something like that, Ethan said, though the weight of that responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. The Henderson facility was in an industrial district outside Cincinnati, a sprawling complex of warehouses and truck bays that had grown organically over 40 years. As they pulled into the parking lot, Ethan saw dozens of big rigs lined up like sleeping giants, American flags and family photos visible in their windshields. The barbecue was already in full swing in a field behind the main warehouse. Picnic tables covered with checkered tablecloths, kids running everywhere, the smell of burgers and hot dogs mixing with diesel fumes and autumn air. It was achingly familiar, like every company picnic Conway Shipping had ever thrown, right down to the cornhole games and the classic rock playing from someone's truck speakers. Richard Henderson spotted them, immediately breaking away from a group of drivers to walk over. His casual clothes jeans and a Henderson Shipping polo shirt made him look less like a CEO and more like what he'd started as a trucker who'd built something from nothing. "Ethan, glad you could make it." He shook hands firmly, then crouched down to Marcus's level. "And you must be the young man I've heard about. You know your dad's pretty famous around here." "He is." Marcus's eyes widened. "Sure is. He's the guy who's going to make sure all these people keep their jobs. That's better than being famous for throwing a football or singing songs, don't you think?" As Henderson led them toward the main gathering, Ethan could feel the eyes on him. Conversations quieted as they passed drivers and warehouse workers sizing him up, trying to reconcile the corporate executive they'd heard about with the man in jeans and a Conway Shipping softball team shirt he'd deliberately worn. "Listen up, everyone," Henderson called out, and the crowd gradually quieted. "This is Ethan Morales from Hayes Global. He's running the integration, which is a fancy way of saying he's the guy who decides what happens to all of us. I wanted you to meet him, ask him questions, and understand that he's not some suit who's never loaded a truck." "How many trucks you loaded then?" The question came from a burly driver with arms like tree trunks and skepticism written across his weathered face. "First truck I loaded was in 2011. Ethan replied, his voice carrying across the field. "Peterson Freight Dock 7 Milwaukee facility. 40,000 pounds of automotive parts in the middle of July with no AC in the warehouse. Last truck I loaded was 8 days ago, actually. Helped my neighbor move, and trust me, a 26-foot U-Haul full of furniture is harder than any commercial load I ever handled." That got a few chuckles, and the tension eased slightly. "What about our routes?" A woman in her 50s stepped forward, worry etched in her features. "I've been driving the Lima to Columbus medical run for 12 years. I know every hospital loading dock, every night shift, supervisor, every shortcut when there's construction. Is some computer going to tell me I'm doing it wrong?" "Ma'am, what's your name?" Ethan asked. "Dorothy. Dorothy Sanderson." "Dorothy, that knowledge you have, that's worth more than any algorithm we could develop. Hayes Global has great technology, but technology doesn't know that St. Mary's Hospital's dock freezes in winter, and you need to use the side entrance. It doesn't know that Columbus General always runs emergency orders on Tuesday nights. You do. We'd be idiots to lose that. So you're keeping our routes." "We're keeping the drivers who know them. The routes might get more efficient with our planning software, but the human element that stays." An older man raised his hand. "What about the trucks? No offense to Mr. Henderson, but we're driving some pretty old equipment." Richard started to speak, but Ethan stepped forward. "Fair question. I've seen the maintenance reports. Average age of the fleet is 12 years, some trucks pushing 20. Here's what I can promise: within the first year, every truck over 15 years old gets replaced. Not with basic models either. Proper sleeper cabs for the long-haul folks, state-of-the-art safety features, the works." "That's expensive," someone called out. "Know what's more expensive? Breakdowns, accidents, losing good drivers because we don't give them proper equipment." Ethan found himself falling into the rhythm he'd used in warehouse safety meetings. "I've driven old trucks. I know what it's like when the AC doesn't work in summer, when the heating's shot in winter, when you're white-knuckling it through rain because the wipers are barely functional. That's not just about comfort, it's about safety and respect." Marcus had wandered over to where some kids were playing soccer, but he kept glancing back at his father, clearly proud of how the adults were listening to him. Mr. Morales, a young driver, probably mid-20s, stepped forward nervously. I just started here 6 months ago, last in, first out, right? Should I be looking for another job? Ethan recognized the fear in the kid's eyes, the same fear he'd carried for years. What's your name? Tyler. Tyler Brooks. Tyler, you have any safety violations? Customer complaints? Problems with your logs? No, sir. Clean record. Then you've got nothing to worry about. We're not doing layoffs based on seniority. If someone has to go and I'm trying to make sure that number is as close to zero as possible, it'll be based on performance and need not who's been here longest. But the news says mergers always mean job cuts, Tyler persisted. Usually they do. But this isn't usual. Henderson has routes and contracts we need. You have knowledge we need. Cutting jobs would be like buying a car and then throwing away the engine. Dorothy spoke up again. You talk a good game, Mr. Morales, but we've heard promises before. What makes you different? Ethan thought about how to answer, then decided on complete honesty. 8 days ago, I was unemployed. Single father, overdue rent, had to choose between gas money and groceries. I got my job at Hayes because I stopped to help someone in a rainstorm, even though it meant missing my interview. That someone turned out to be Alexandra Hayes. The crowd had gone completely silent now. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck. I know the fear of losing your job, of not being able to provide for your family. I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I can promise that every decision I make will consider the people affected by it. Because I've been you. Hell, I still am you, just with a newer suit. Your kid goes to public school, someone asked. Marshall Elementary, same one I would have gone to if we'd stayed in Cincinnati. He's on the free lunch program, actually. I should probably update that now, but honestly, I forgot. That admission broke something in the crowd's resistance. These were people who understood forgetting to update paperwork, who knew what free lunch programs meant, who recognized one of their own, even if he was wearing a different uniform now. The questions continued for another hour, ranging from technical concerns about system integration to worries about health insurance changes. Ethan answered them all, sometimes admitting he didn't have all the answers yet, but promising to find them. Marcus had joined the soccer game fully, now showing off the moves he'd learned at the YMCA, and Ethan felt a profound sense of rightness about the whole scene. As the sun began to set, Richard pulled Ethan aside. You did good today. They trust you, and that's not easy to earn. But they trust that I understand their world. Whether I can deliver on the promises, that's what matters. You know, when I started this company, it was just me and one truck. Built it up over 40 years, and now I'm watching it get absorbed by a corporation. Should break my heart, but watching you talk to my people, maybe this is how it was supposed to go. It doesn't have to be an ending, Richard. It can be an evolution. The older man smiled. You sound like my daughter. She's been telling me for years that we needed to modernize or die. Maybe being part of Hayes is how we modernize without losing our soul. That's the plan. As they were preparing to leave, Dorothy Sanderson approached with a small group of drivers. Mr. Morales, we were talking. Would you be willing to ride along on some of our routes? See what we actually do, the challenges we face that don't show up in reports. When? I do the Monday morning medical run. Leaves at 4 a.m., gets back around 2 p.m. It's not glamorous. I'll be there, Ethan said immediately. Text me the details. As they drove back to Columbus in the darkness, Marcus was full of stories about the kids he'd played with, the hot dogs he'd eaten, the truck he'd gotten to sit in. Dad, those people really like you, he said sleepily. I hope so, buddy. That lady Dorothy, she said you're going to save their jobs. Are you... I'm going to try. Mom would say that's all anyone can do, try their best. Ethan reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. Yeah, she would say that. Sunday was supposedly a day off, but Ethan spent it preparing for the week ahead. The ride-along with Dorothy, 3 integration meetings, a conference call with potential investors interested in the Rural Medical Initiative in preparation for the board presentation. Patricia had sent him a dozen files to review, and Sarah had added financial projections that needed his approval. But he made time for Marcus, too. They went to the park, played catch, and had dinner at their favorite pizza place, which now felt oddly humble compared to the restaurants his corporate card could access. Dad, are we rich now? Marcus asked over pepperoni pizza. We're comfortable. We can pay our bills, save for college, not worry about every dollar. But rich is about more than money. Like what? Like having work that matters, having people who trust you, having the chance to help others. Ethan thought about his own father, who defined rich as not having to check the price at the grocery store. By that measure, yes, they were rich now. Monday's 4 a.m. alarm came too soon, but Ethan was at the Henderson facility by 3:45 wearing jeans and steel-toed boots he'd kept from his warehouse days. Dorothy was already doing her pre-trip inspection on a well-worn Freightliner that had seen better days. Didn't think you'd actually show, she said, not looking up from checking the tire pressure. I said I would. Plenty of executives say things they don't mean. I'm not plenty of executives. She straightened up, studying him. No, I guess you're not. Climb in. We've got 6 hospitals to hit before noon, and the first one has a critical shipment of cardiac stents that absolutely cannot be late. The inside of the truck was exactly as Ethan remembered from his brief stint as a driver-worn seats patched with duct tape, a CB radio crackling with early morning chatter photos of family members taped to the dashboard. Dorothy had pictures of what looked like grandchildren, a Purple Heart, from what must have been her military service, and a small cross hanging from the rearview mirror. As they pulled onto the highway, the sky still dark, Dorothy began explaining her route with the precision of someone who'd perfected every detail. First stop, Lima General. They've got a narrow dock, and you have to back in at an angle because of the dumpsters they refuse to move. Been asking them for 5 years to relocate those things, but hospitals don't listen to truck drivers. What if Hayes Global asked them? Dorothy snorted. You think a big corporation carries more weight than a truck driver? I think a corporation that controls their medical supply chain might get their attention. She glanced at him sideways. You'd use that leverage for something as small as moving dumpsters. Small to who? Not to the driver who has to navigate around them 5 days a week. Not to the hospital when a delivery gets delayed because a new driver couldn't manage the approach. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the highway empty except for other trucks beginning their workday. The CB chatter was familiar drivers warning each other about speed traps, construction zones, weather conditions ahead. It was a community Ethan realized, one that existed parallel to the corporate world, but was just as vital. Tell me about the other drivers, Ethan said. The ones who are really worried about the merger. Dorothy sighed. Tom Martinez, he's got a special needs kid. Henderson's insurance covers the therapy, and he's terrified Hayes will switch to a plan that doesn't. Sarah Williams, she's putting 2 kids through college on a driver's salary. Any pay cut would mean they'd have to drop out. Jimmy Chen, he's 62, too young to retire, but old enough that finding another job would be nearly impossible. Make a list, Ethan said, pulling out his phone to take notes. Everyone with specific concerns. I'll address each one personally. You can't solve everyone's problems. No, but I can try. And the ones I can't solve, at least they'll know someone listened. Lima General appeared in the pre-dawn darkness, its emergency room lights blazing. Dorothy expertly maneuvered the truck into the impossible loading dock, and Ethan jumped out to help unload. The hospital's receiving clerk, a tired-looking man named Frank, did a double take. Dorothy, who's your helper? Frank, meet Ethan Morales. He's the Hayes Global executive running the merger. Frank nearly dropped his clipboard. An executive is doing ride-alongs. Apparently this one does, Dorothy said with something that might have been pride. The physical work of unloading medical supplies was harder than Ethan remembered, his executive life having softened him slightly. But muscle memory kicked in. Lift with your legs pivot from your hips. Always check the weight before committing to the lift. By the 3rd hospital, he was sweating through his shirt despite the cool morning air. You're keeping up better than I expected, Dorothy admitted as they pulled into Columbus General. I've loaded trucks in worse conditions. July in Phoenix, no AC in the warehouse, 100-pound boxes of machine parts. Why'd you leave that life? I didn't choose to at first. Got promoted to supervisor, then manager, worked my way up. But I never forgot what the actual work felt like. Too many executives do. At Columbus General, they encountered a problem. The shipment of insulin was supposed to be refrigerated, but the cooling unit on Dorothy's truck had failed somewhere between hospitals. Shit, Dorothy muttered, checking the temperature gauge. It's borderline. Might still be good, But if they reject it, they have to reject it, Ethan said. Patient safety comes first, but here's what we're going to do. He pulled out his phone and called Sarah Martinez, who answered despite it being 7 a.m. Sarah, I need a refrigerated truck at Columbus General in 30 minutes with a replacement insulin shipment. Pull it from our Columbus warehouse. Ethan, that's Hayes' inventory, not Henderson. We're one company in 4 weeks. Make it happen. He hung up and turned to Dorothy. We'll wait for the replacement. Document everything for insurance, and I'll make sure this doesn't count against your performance record. This cooling unit has been failing for months. Richard knows, but repairs are expensive. Not as expensive as losing a shipment of insulin, or losing a contract because we couldn't deliver. Ethan made another note. Every truck gets a maintenance review this week. Anything critical gets fixed immediately. The replacement truck arrived in 25 minutes, Sarah having worked her magic. The hospital never knew how close they'd come to not receiving critical medication. As they transferred the insulin, Dorothy watched Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite read. You didn't have to do that. Could have let me take the hit shown Henderson's weaknesses to justify changes. That's not how I work. No, she said softly. I'm beginning to see that. The rest of the route went smoothly, and Dorothy shared stories from her 12 years on the road. She talked about delivering cancer medications to a small rural hospital and seeing the same patients week after week, watching some recover and others fade. She spoke of driving through blizzards because dialysis supplies couldn't wait for better weather. She described the night she'd broken protocol to deliver an emergency heart medication directly to a patient's home because the hospital's order had been delayed. That's the part corporate never understands, she said as they headed back to Cincinnati. We're not just moving boxes, we're part of people's survival. I understand, Ethan said. My wife died because an ambulance couldn't get blood supplies in time. Car accident, rural road, the nearest trauma center was 40 minutes away. If there had been a closer supply depot, if the logistics had been better... Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry. It was 4 years ago. But it's why this matters to me. It's not about profit margins or market share. It's about making sure the supplies are where they need to be when someone's life depends on it. They arrived back at Henderson just after 2 p.m. as Dorothy had predicted. Richard was waiting in the yard along with several other drivers who'd apparently heard about the ride-along. How'd he do, Dorothy? Richard asked. He'll do, she said simply, which Ethan could tell from Richard's expression was high praise indeed. The ride back to Columbus was a blur of phone calls. The insulin incident had revealed systemic maintenance issues throughout Henderson's fleet. Ethan authorized emergency repairs negotiated with Hayes' preferred vendors for bulk discounts and set up a maintenance schedule that would prevent future failures. You're spending a lot of money, Patricia warned him during one call. I'm preventing a lot of problems, he countered. What's the cost of losing a hospital contract because we can't deliver? What's the cost of a driver getting hurt because equipment failed? By the time he reached his office, Sarah was waiting with a stack of invoices and a worried expression. Ethan, you authorized almost $200,000 in repairs today. I did. Without board approval. It's within my discretionary budget. Barely, and it's going to raise questions. Good. Let them ask. I'll have Dorothy Sanderson explain to the board why she's been driving with a failing refrigeration unit for 3 months. I'll have her describe what happens when insulin isn't delivered on time. Sarah studied him. You're taking this personally. Shouldn't I? We're asking these people to trust us with their livelihoods. The least we can do is give them working equipment. Alexandra wants to see you. Fair warning, she's gotten calls from several board members about the expenses. Ethan found Alexandra in the boardroom reviewing financial projections on multiple screens. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. $200,000 in 1 day, she said. It would have been more, but I negotiated bulk discounts. Explain. Ethan laid out what he'd seen, the deteriorating equipment, the safety risks, the potential for catastrophic failures that could cost contracts and lives. He described Dorothy's professionalism, despite inadequate tools, the other drivers' fears about their futures, and the insulin incident that could have been a disaster. So you made a unilateral decision to fix everything immediately. I made an executive decision to prevent future crises rather than react to them. Alexandra was quiet for a moment, then smiled. Good. That's exactly what I hired you to do. But next time, give me a heads up so I can prepare for the board's phone calls. There's something else, Ethan said. The Rural Medical Initiative, I want to expand it. Not just integrate what Henderson has, but actively pursue new contracts with rural hospitals. There's a network of 63 critical access hospitals across 5 states that are underserved. If we can guarantee reliable delivery at competitive prices, you're talking about a massive expansion. I'm talking about saving lives while making profit. The two don't have to be mutually exclusive. Alexandra pulled up a map on one of the screens. Show me. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the proposal. Ethan had done his homework, demographics, distance analyses, competitive landscape, projected revenues and costs. But more than numbers, he had stories from Dorothy and the other drivers' real-world intelligence that no market analysis could provide. The board will want hard numbers, Alexandra said. I'll give them those, but I'll also give them something else, the moral argument. Hayes Global can be the company that ensures no rural hospital runs out of critical supplies. That's not just good business, it's good citizenship. You're going to make that argument to a room full of investors who only care about returns. I'm going to make them understand that returns come from reputation, and reputation comes from reliability. Every rural hospital we serve becomes a reference. Every small town we reach becomes a market foothold. Let our competitors fight over the big city contracts. We'll own everything else. Alexandra stood walking to the window that overlooked the city. The board meeting is in 3 weeks. You'll have 15 minutes to present. I'll need 30. You'll have 15. Make them count. As Ethan left her office, his phone rang. It was Marcus's school. Mr. Morales, this is Principal Johnson. There's been an incident with Marcus. Ethan's heart stopped. Is he okay? He's fine, but he was in a fight. We need you to come in. The drive to the school was agony, every worst-case scenario playing through Ethan's mind. Marcus had never been in a fight, had always been the quiet kid who avoided conflict. He found Marcus in the principal's office, sporting a split lip and defiant eyes. Another boy sat across the room with a black eye, his parents already present and looking furious. Mr. Morales, Principal Johnson began, Marcus punched Timothy here during recess. He said Dad was a liar, Marcus burst out. He said there's no way a truck driver became a director in 1 week, that Dad was making it up to seem important. Timothy's father, wearing a suit that screamed middle management, snorted. Can you blame him? Does sound far-fetched. Ethan looked at the man, then at his son, then back at Marcus. Did you hit him first? Marcus nodded, ashamed now. I know you said violence is never the answer, but he kept saying you were a nobody, pretending to be somebody, and I got so mad. Mr. Morales, Timothy's mother interjected, your son gave Timothy a black eye. There need to be consequences. You're right, Ethan said, then turned to Marcus. Apologize to Timothy. But Dad, now. Marcus mumbled an apology, clearly not meaning it. Timothy, Ethan said to the other boy, I did become a director at Hayes Global last week. It does sound unbelievable, but it's true. Would you like to see my business card? The boy looked uncertain, glancing at his parents. Ethan pulled out one of his cards, handing it to Timothy's father. Senior Director of Emergency Operations. You can call the main number and verify if you'd like. The man's face went through several expressions before settling on embarrassment. That's not necessary. Marcus was wrong to hit your son, Ethan continued. Violence is never the solution to words, no matter how hurtful. But perhaps Timothy could also apologize for calling me a liar. After awkward apologies all around and a stern warning from the principal, Ethan walked Marcus to the car in silence. Once inside, he finally spoke. You want to tell me what really happened? Marcus's tough facade crumbled. It wasn't just Timothy. A bunch of kids were saying we were poor, that we lived in a bad apartment, that you couldn't really have an important job. And I knew it was true, the poor part I mean, but also not true anymore, and I didn't know how to explain it, and Timothy just kept pushing and pushing. And you snapped. Yeah. Ethan pulled into a parking lot and turned to face his son. Marcus, we were poor. That's not shameful. It's just fact. We're not poor now, but that could change. Jobs can be lost. Situations can shift. What matters isn't what people say about where we come from, but who we choose to be. You chose to help that lady in the rain. And that choice changed everything. But even if it hadn't, even if I'd missed that interview and we were still in the same situation, would that make us less valuable as people? Marcus thought about it. No. No. Timothy's parents probably have more money than we do even now. Does that make them better than us? They seemed kind of mean. They were protecting their son just like I protect you. But Marcus, you can't fight everyone who says something you don't like. You know what the best revenge is? What? Success. Living well. Being happy. And at the board meeting next month when you're there watching me present to some of the most powerful people in the business world, Timothy, and everyone else will see that sometimes impossible things happen. I can really come. Ms. Hayes specifically invited you, but only if you promise no more fights. I promise. That evening, while Marcus did homework with extra focus, his punishment was no video games for a week. Ethan worked on his board presentation. He thought about Dorothy's devotion to her route, Richard's pride in his company, the drivers who just wanted job security and respect. He thought about rural hospitals depending on reliable deliveries and patients whose lives hung in the balance of logistics. His phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. Heard what you did about the truck repairs. Also heard you're presenting to the board about rural medical expansion. The drivers are talking. They think you might actually be one of the good ones. He texted back, just trying to do the right thing. That's what makes you one of the good ones. As midnight approached, Ethan looked at his presentation, 27 slides of numbers, projections, and strategies. It was good, solid, defensible. But it wasn't enough. The board needed to see what he'd seen, feel what he'd felt. Writing with Dorothy. Understand that this was about more than market share. He opened a new slide and began typing, the human cost of logistics failure. It would be risky bringing emotion into a boardroom that dealt in facts and figures. But Ethan had built his new life on taking the right risks. Stopping for Alexandra had been a risk. Taking the job had been a risk. Spending $200,000 on repairs had been a risk. Some risks were worth taking. He added a photo Dorothy had shared her delivering Christmas presents, along with medical supplies to a children's hospital in rural Ohio. The unofficial extra mile that no algorithm would ever capture, but that built the loyalty companies couldn't buy. Another slide, what we deliver besides packages. It listed the intangibles, hope to cancer patients, independence to dialysis patients, life to trauma victims. These weren't metrics that would show up in quarterly reports, but they were the reason the work mattered. By 2 a.m., he had 40 slides, far too many for 15 minutes. But he'd figure out how to condense them, how to tell the story that needed telling. Because that's what this was, a story about how good business and good humanity could be the same thing. Marcus was asleep on the couch, having tried to wait up for him. Ethan covered him with a blanket, then stood watching his son sleep, thinking about the example he was setting. Not just of success, but of service. Not just of climbing the ladder, but of making sure it stayed stable for others to climb. His phone lit up with one more message, this one from Alexandra. Heard about the school incident. Your son defending your honor must have been interesting. See you tomorrow. We need to discuss accelerating the Henderson integration. Accelerating. Everything was accelerating. 3 weeks ago, he'd been nobody. Now he was responsible for hundreds of jobs, millions in revenue, and a vision that could transform rural medical logistics. The weight of it should have been crushing. Instead, it felt like purpose. Like the moment when a load you've been struggling to balance finally settles into place and you realize you're stronger than you thought. Through the window, the city lights twinkled, each one representing someone depending on the vast network of logistics that kept the world running. Somewhere Dorothy was probably planning tomorrow's route. Richard was likely losing sleep over his company's future. The board members were definitely questioning Alexandra's judgment in hiring him. But Ethan Morales, who'd learned to carry whatever weight life put on his shoulders, was ready for all of it. The presentation would work or it wouldn't. The integration would succeed or fail. The rural medical initiative would transform the company or become a costly mistake. What mattered was that he was trying with everything he had to build something worthwhile. To prove that a man who'd stopped to help a stranger could change not just his own life, but hundreds of others. To show his son that integrity and success weren't mutually exclusive, that where you came from mattered less than where you chose to go. The radiator had finally stopped its clanging. The landlord had fixed it after Ethan paid 3 months' rent in advance. The silence felt strange, like losing a familiar adversary. But that was the nature of progress. You fixed problems and moved on to new ones. And Ethan had plenty of new problems to solve. Tomorrow would bring integration meetings, personnel decisions, and the constant balance of corporate demands and human needs. But tonight, with his son safe and his purpose clear, he felt ready for whatever storms lay ahead. The boy who'd loaded trucks was becoming the man who coordinated entire supply chains. The single father who'd counted pennies was becoming the executive who authorized millions in spending. The person who'd stopped to help was becoming the leader others looked to for help. It was, as Marcus would say, like being a superhero. Only instead of a cape, he wore a suit he was still getting used to. Instead of superpowers, he had experience and empathy. And instead of fighting villains, he was fighting the indifference and inefficiency that kept help from reaching those who needed it most. The morning of the board presentation arrived with an unseasonable November snow. Delicate flakes drifting past the apartment window as Ethan adjusted his tie for the 5th time. Marcus sat on the bed already dressed in his best clothes, a navy blazer and khakis they'd bought specifically for today. "You nervous, Dad?" Marcus asked, swinging his legs. "Terrified," Ethan admitted, then caught himself. "I mean, a little nervous. Mom used to say being nervous means you care about doing good." "Your mom was smart." Ethan sat beside his son, remembering Lisa's way of simplifying complex emotions into manageable truths. "You remember what we talked about. During the presentation, you need to sit quietly." "I know, Dad. Mrs. Chen already gave me the lecture, twice." Marcus grinned. "She also said to imagine everyone in their underwear if I get bored. Mrs. Chen said that she says it works for her at her senior center meetings." The drive to Hayes Global felt different this morning. The security guard waved them through with a respectful nod, and Ethan's reserved parking spot, still surreal to have one, was clear, despite the accumulating snow. As they walked through the lobby, several employees recognized him and offered encouraging smiles. Word had spread about the Henderson integration, about the truck repairs, about the executive who actually rode along on delivery routes. Patricia met them at the elevator, her usually composed face showing hints of concern. "The board members are already gathering. Richard Henderson arrived an hour ago. He's been talking to them." "Talking about what?" "The integration. He brought Dorothy Sanderson with him." Ethan's stomach dropped. If Henderson was having second thoughts, if he was poisoning the board against the expansion plan, where are they? Executive Lounge, 35th floor. "But Ethan, your presentation isn't for another hour." He was already moving toward the elevator, Marcus hurrying to keep up. "Keep my time slot. I'll be ready." The Executive Lounge was a space Ethan had never entered, all leather and mahogany oil paintings of previous CEOs watching from the walls. Richard Henderson stood near the window, speaking earnestly to 3 board members Ethan recognized from photos: David Chang, the lead investor, Margaret Sterling, former Secretary of Commerce, and James Wright, who ran his own logistics empire before joining Hayes's board. Dorothy stood slightly apart, looking uncomfortable, in business attire instead of her usual driver's uniform. She spotted Ethan first and gave him a subtle nod that he couldn't quite interpret. Morales." Wright called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Henderson here was just telling us about your roadside assistance last Monday." "The ride along," Ethan corrected carefully. "I wanted to understand the operational challenges firsthand, and authorized $200,000 in repairs on the spot." Chang added, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. "That's quite a financial commitment without board consultation." Before Ethan could respond, Dorothy stepped forward. "May I say something?" The board members looked surprised. Drivers didn't typically speak in executive lounges, but Sterling nodded. "Please, Ms. Sanderson. Dorothy Sanderson. I've been driving medical routes for 12 years, and in all that time, no executive has ever asked me what I need to do my job better. They've told me sure. Mandated new procedures, installed tracking systems, cut costs. But asked never. Until Mr. Morales." She pulled out her phone, scrolling to something. "This is a photo from 3 years ago. That's me changing a tire in a blizzard because the company couldn't afford proper winter maintenance. This is from last year, delivering insulin in a truck with no working refrigeration during a heat wave, using bags of gas station ice to keep it cool. And this, she showed another image. This is my truck as of yesterday. New tires, working refrigeration, proper safety equipment. First time in 5 years everything actually works. Wright leaned forward. And you attribute this to Morales. I attribute it to having someone in charge who understands that we're not just moving boxes, we're keeping people alive. He gets that because he's done the work. Chang turned to Richard. And you support this approach. Even though it's costing your company money, it doesn't have, Richard smiled slightly. My company hasn't had money for proper maintenance in 2 years. We've been surviving on reputation and driver dedication. Ethan's investment isn't just fixing trucks, it's showing my people that Hayes Global values them. You can't buy that kind of loyalty. Actually, Wright said dryly, it sounds like you can, for about $200,000. With respect, Mr. Wright, Ethan interjected, finding his voice, you can't buy it. You can only earn it. The money just demonstrates commitment. The loyalty comes from following through. Margaret Sterling studied him with interest. Young man, and you are remarkably young for this position, Alexandra's faith in you is evident. But the board needs more than faith. We need results. Then let me show you results, Ethan said. My presentation isn't just about rural medical expansion. It's about transforming how Hayes Global thinks about logistics. We'll see in an hour, Chang said, but his expression had softened slightly. As the board members dispersed, Dorothy approached Ethan. I hope I didn't overstep. You said exactly what needed saying. Thank you. She glanced at Marcus, who'd been silently absorbing everything. This your boy. Marcus, this is Ms. Dorothy. She drives the trucks that deliver medicine to hospitals. Marcus's eyes widened. Like an ambulance, Dorothy laughed. Kind of, but I deliver before people get sick so they have what they need when they do. Your dad's making sure I can keep doing that. Cool, sir, Marcus said. Then looked up at his father with something approaching awe. The hour before the presentation passed in a blur. Patricia brought updated figures showing that the Henderson integration was actually ahead of schedule. Drivers were volunteering for overtime to help with the transition, seeing it as an investment in their own futures. Sarah had run new projections based on the rural hospital contacts Ethan had made, and the numbers were even better than anticipated. Nervous? Alexandra asked, appearing in his office doorway minutes before the presentation. My son asked me the same thing this morning. And terrified, but ready. She smiled. Good. Confidence without fear is just arrogance. Fear without confidence is paralysis. You found the balance. She looked at Marcus, who was practicing sitting still in one of the office chairs. Mr. Marcus, are you ready to see your father change some minds? Yes, ma'am, Marcus said formally, making both adults smile. The boardroom was intimidating by design, a massive oval table surrounded by 20 leather chairs, screens on every wall, windows offering a commanding view of the city. The board members were already seated, their faces ranging from curious to skeptical. In addition to those he'd met earlier, there were another dozen people, investors, advisors, senior executives. Ethan took his position at the head of the table, his presentation remote feeling small in his hand. Marcus sat in a chair against the wall between Patricia and Alexandra, his eyes wide but his posture perfect. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. I'm here to talk to you about the future of Hayes Global. Not the next quarter or the next year, but the next decade. And it starts with understanding that logistics isn't about moving things, it's about connecting lives. He clicked to his first slide, a map of the United States with dots representing hospitals. Green dots for major metropolitan hospitals, red for rural facilities. The green dots are where we make our money. The red dots are where we make our difference. Today I'm proposing we do both. For the next 10 minutes, he laid out the numbers with Sarah's precision market size growth potential competitive advantages. The board members took notes, asked pointed questions about margins and scalability. It was going well, but not great, the kind of presentation that might get approved, but wouldn't inspire. Then Ethan switched tactics. Let me tell you about Betty Morrison, he said, pulling up a photo Dorothy had shared, an elderly woman in a hospital bed, smiling, despite obvious illness. She lives in Murray, Kentucky, population 367. Every week she needs dialysis supplies delivered to the regional clinic 40 miles from her home. Last winter, those supplies were 3 days late because the logistics company serving the area decided the route wasn't profitable enough to maintain during a snowstorm. He clicked to the next slide. Betty Morrison died waiting for those supplies. The room went silent. This isn't just about her. There are thousands of Betty Morrisons across rural America. People whose lives depend on reliable medical logistics, but who live in areas deemed unprofitable by traditional metrics. James Wright interrupted. With respect, Mr. Morales, we're not a charity. We have obligations to our shareholders. You're right, Ethan agreed, surprising him. Which is why I'm not proposing charity. I'm proposing strategic market domination through service excellence. He pulled up his financial projections. Rural hospitals are desperate for reliable suppliers. They'll pay premium prices for guaranteed service. But more importantly, they're connected. Every rural hospital administrator knows every other administrator in their state. Serve one well and word spreads. Fail one, and that spreads too. The network effect, Sterling murmured, understanding dawning. Exactly. We start with Henderson's existing routes, expand strategically, and within 18 months we own rural medical logistics for the entire Midwest. Our competitors are fighting over saturated urban markets while we quietly lock up an underserved sector worth, he clicked to the next slide, $47 billion annually. Chang leaned forward. Those numbers assume perfect execution. No, those numbers assume competent execution. Perfect execution would double them. Ethan pulled up another slide showing driver retention rates. Henderson's drivers have a 92% retention rate despite old equipment and low pay. Why? Because they believe in what they're doing. Give them proper resources and competitive wages, and that becomes 98%. Do you know what driver turnover costs this industry? About $8,000 per driver, Wright said. Multiply that by the thousands of drivers we won't have to replace, and the investment pays for itself. But there's something else, something that doesn't show up in spreadsheets. He clicked to a photo of himself from the week before, muddy, exhausted, helping Dorothy unload supplies at Columbus General. This is me last Monday. I could have sent someone else to do the ride-along or skipped it entirely. But leadership isn't about giving orders from a boardroom. It's about understanding the reality of the work. Every driver who saw this photo, and trust me, Dorothy, made sure they all did knows that management understands their challenges. That's worth more than any retention bonus. Margaret Sterling spoke up. You're proposing a fundamental shift in how Hayes Global operates. Less focus on automation and efficiency, more on human elements. I'm proposing we recognize that humans are our efficiency. A computer can plot the fastest route, but it can't know that the loading dock at Lima General floods every April, or that the night supervisor at Columbus Memorial always needs supplies by 10 p.m. for the morning shift. Our drivers know these things. They are our competitive advantage. What about scalability? Another board member asked. This high-touch approach works for Henderson's size, but Hayes is 20 times larger. Which is why we're creating a hybrid model. Technology handles what it does best. Routing optimization, inventory management, predictive analytics. Humans handle what they do best, relationship building, problem solving, last-mile adaptation. We're not choosing between efficiency and humanity. We're combining them. Alexandra stood. If I may add something, 3 weeks ago, our entire East Coast network crashed. The technical team said it would take 72 hours to fix. Ethan solved it in 4 hours. Not because he's a better programmer, but because he saw the human solution the computers missed. That's the approach he's proposing company-wide. David Chang had been doing calculations on his tablet. If these projections are accurate, we're looking at a 17% increase in revenue within 2 years. Conservative estimate, Ethan said. It doesn't account for the government contracts we'll be positioned to win. The federal government is mandating improved rural healthcare access. They'll need logistics partners who can actually deliver. Literally, someone quipped, causing a ripple of laughter that eased the tension. James Wright stood walking to the window. Morales, you're asking us to invest millions in an unproven strategy based on the idea that treating drivers well and serving unprofitable routes will somehow generate profits. I'm asking you to invest in the radical idea that doing the right thing is also the smart thing, that a company's value isn't just its stock price, but its impact on society, that employees who believe in their work perform better than those who just collect paychecks. Wright turned back. And if you're wrong, then we'll still be the logistics company that ensures no rural hospital runs out of critical supplies. We'll still be the employer that drivers want to work for. We'll still be the company that stopped putting algorithms ahead of human lives. Even if I'm wrong about the profits, which I'm not, I'm right about the principle. The room fell silent. Board members exchanged glances, conducting entire conversations with looks and subtle nods. Finally, Chang spoke. We'll need detailed implementation plans, milestone markers, and regular progress reports. You'll have them, Ethan promised. And oversight. This is too big to run without board involvement. Agreed with one condition. Ride along with the drivers, see what they see. You can't oversee what you don't understand. That caused some shuffling and uncomfortable looks, but Sterling smiled. I haven't been in a truck since I was transportation secretary. Might be educational. All in favor of the Rural Medical Expansion Initiative, Alexandra called. One by one, hands rose. Not all of them. Wright still looked skeptical, and two others abstained, but a clear majority. Motion carries, Alexandra announced. Congratulations, Mr. Morales. You just changed the direction of a Fortune 500 company. As the board members filed out, several stopped to shake Ethan's hand. Margaret Sterling paused longer. That was one of the most compelling presentations I've seen in 40 years of board meetings. You didn't just present numbers, you told a story. Made us care. It's easy to make people care when you care yourself. She glanced at Marcus, who was trying very hard to contain his excitement. Your son. Yes, ma'am. He's very proud of you. Make sure he stays that way. After everyone left, Marcus launched himself at Ethan. Dad, that was amazing. You were like a superhero giving a speech. And they all listened. They did more than listen, buddy. They agreed to help a lot of people. Alexandra approached, her professional mask slipping to reveal genuine warmth. You exceeded every expectation. The Betty Morrison story, that was brilliant. It was true. Dorothy told me about her. The best stories always are. She looked at Marcus. Your father just secured funding for a project that will affect millions of lives. You should be very proud. I am, Marcus said simply. As they prepared to leave, Ethan's phone rang. It was Richard Henderson. Heard the good news, Richard said. The drivers are celebrating. Dorothy's buying rounds at Murphy's Tavern. You should come. Ethan looked at Marcus. Want to go to a trucker bar? Is that allowed? Today. Today, anything's allowed. Murphy's Tavern was exactly what Ethan expected. Dim lights, worn pool tables, and a jukebox playing classic rock. But it was packed with Henderson drivers all raising glasses as Ethan walked in with Marcus. There he is, Dorothy called out, the executive who got his hands dirty. The celebration was unlike any corporate event Ethan had attended. These were people who measured success in miles driven safely, packages delivered on time, and families supported. They didn't care about stock prices or market shares. They cared about job security and respect. Mr. Morales, a young driver approached nervously. I'm Tyler Brooks. We met at the barbecue. I remember. You were worried about layoffs. Yes, sir. I wanted to say, my wife's pregnant. We found out last week. And knowing my job's safe, that we'll have good insurance, you don't know what that means. I do know, Ethan said quietly. Congratulations on the baby. As the evening wore on, Marcus played pool with some of the drivers' kids, while Ethan listened to story after story. Drivers talked about close calls, difficult deliveries, the satisfaction of knowing their cargo mattered. They spoke of families, mortgages, kids in college, aging parents, real lives that depended on paychecks that Ethan now had the power to protect or eliminate. Heavy is the head that wears the crown, Richard said, joining him at the bar. I'm not wearing a crown. I'm wearing a target. Every decision I make affects hundreds of people. Thousands, actually, once the expansion kicks in. Richard signaled for 2 beers. But here's the thing. You've got something most executives lose. You remember being on the other side. Don't lose that. How do you not lose it? Richard pointed to the room full of drivers. You keep showing up here. You keep your hands dirty. You remember that every spreadsheet represents someone's livelihood. Dorothy approached with someone Ethan didn't recognize, a young woman in her 20s with intelligent eyes and a confident bearing. "Mr. Morales, this is my daughter Angela. She just graduated with a degree in logistics management." Angela shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Morales, I've been following the Henderson integration. Your approach to maintaining driver expertise while upgrading infrastructure, it's exactly what they should be teaching in business school, but don't." "You looking for a job?" Ethan asked. "I had offers from Amazon and FedEx, but after seeing what you're building here, Hayes Global is where I want to be. Send me your resume. We're going to need smart people who understand both the technical and human sides of this business." As the evening wound down, Ethan found himself outside with Marcus, who was fighting to stay awake. "Dad, those people really like you," Marcus said sleepily. "They like that someone's fighting for them. Is that what you do now? Fight for people?" Ethan thought about it. 3 weeks ago, he'd been fighting just to survive. Now he was fighting for something larger, for the idea that business could be both profitable and humane, that success didn't require sacrificing integrity. "Yeah, buddy, I guess that's what I do now." The drive home was quiet, Marcus asleep in the passenger seat, the city lights blurring past. Ethan's phone had been buzzing with messages. Congratulations from Sarah and Princeton Media requests. Patricia was fielding even a text from Jennifer saying she'd heard about the board presentation and was impressed. But the message that mattered most came from Alexandra. "Today you proved me right about you, but more importantly, you proved yourself right about what Hayes Global could be. This is just the beginning." She was right. The rural medical expansion was approved but not implemented. The Henderson integration was progressing but not complete. There would be obstacles, setbacks, probably failures. Not everyone would embrace the changes. Some board members remained skeptical. Competitors would try to copy or counter their strategy. But sitting at a red light, watching his son sleep peacefully, Ethan felt ready for all of it. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a man desperate for a chance. Now he was a man creating chances for others. The light turned green and he drove on through the quiet streets. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, implementation meetings, budget reviews, the 1,000 details that turned vision into reality. He'd need to balance boardroom politics with driver concerns, profit margins with human needs, corporate expectations with personal values. But tonight, he'd won. Not just the board's approval or the driver's trust, but something more fundamental, the knowledge that he belonged in this new life, that he'd earned it not through luck or charity, but through competence and character. His phone rang as he pulled into their apartment complex. It was Dorothy. "Ethan, I wanted you to know what you did today, what you're doing for us. My husband was a driver too, died 3 years ago when his rig broke down on the highway, faulty brakes the company knew about but didn't fix. What you're doing with the maintenance, the safety improvements, you're not just saving jobs, you're saving lives. Dorothy, I don't need to say anything. Just wanted you to know that when you talk about logistics being about connecting lives, we hear you, we believe you, and we've got your back." After getting Marcus to bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop beginning to draft the implementation plan the board had requested. But his mind kept drifting to that morning 3 weeks ago when he'd stopped to help Alexandra. Such a small decision, pull over or keep driving, that had cascaded into all of this. He thought about the butterfly effect, how tiny changes could have massive consequences. If he'd left 5 minutes earlier that morning, if Alexandra had taken a different route, if the rain hadn't been quite so heavy, 1,000 small variables that had aligned to create this opportunity. But it wasn't really about luck, was it? It was about being the kind of person who stopped to help. That characteristic, that instinct to put others' needs alongside his own, had been there long before that rainy morning. The opportunity had simply revealed it. His laptop screen showed the beginning of his implementation plan, Phase 1 Human Infrastructure. Before upgrading technology or expanding routes, he would invest in people, training programs for rural route drivers, safety bonuses, a driver advisory council that would have direct input on operational decisions. It was unconventional, possibly naive, definitely risky. But it was right. And Ethan had learned that doing the right thing consistently and courageously had a way of working out. A text from Marcus's teacher appeared. Heard about your presentation from Principal Johnson. The whole school's talking about Marcus's dad, the hero executive. He was beaming all day. Hero executive. Ethan shook his head at the phrase. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone trying to do his job well while remembering what it felt like to need someone to do their job well for him. But if Marcus wanted to see him as a hero, if the drivers needed someone to believe in, if the board expected miracles, well, he'd given up more comfortable positions for worse reasons. The radiator in the new apartment they'd moved the previous weekend hummed quietly efficiently. Nothing like the clanging monster of their old place. But Ethan found himself missing that sound, that reminder of where they'd come from. Success, he was learning, wasn't about forgetting your struggles, but about using them to understand others. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Turning promises into reality, vision into execution, hope into tangible change. There would be setbacks, there always were. Some rural hospitals might resist change. Some drivers might struggle with new technology. Some board members might push back on costs. But tonight, in the quiet of his new apartment with his son, safe and his future secure, Ethan Morales allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd traveled from loading dock to boardroom in 3 weeks. He'd transformed a personal crisis into an opportunity to help hundreds of others. He'd shown his son that integrity and success weren't mutually exclusive. The computer screen glowed with plans and projections, strategies, and spreadsheets. But behind all the corporate language and financial models was something simpler. A man who'd stopped to help someone in the rain, and in doing so had discovered not just a job, but a purpose. The storm that had brought Alexandra Hayes into his life had passed, but its effects rippled outward like waves on water. Each driver whose job was saved, each rural hospital that received reliable deliveries, each family that stayed together because a parent kept their employment. They were all connected to that moment on the highway when Ethan chose help over self-interest.